That was their recommendation.
So with that solid start, we'll move on. We do want to welcome all of the TAC members around the room. Want to welcome also the subject matter experts that are sitting in on today's meeting. Also delighted to have a number of the FCC staff members, particularly those who serve as liaisons, but others as well. Welcome our televiewing audience. As you recall, there are those in the room. There are a fair number of people who sit and watch what we do over our shoulders, as it were, and we'll welcome them as well, and certainly welcome any visitors that choose to wander in. I had the interesting situation of meeting one of my nephews last night, and he suggested that he might even come and visit this because it just sounded like such an interesting event to come while he was otherwise touring Washington, D.C. So you never know who's watching and who's showing that interest.
Paul Manafort recently found that out too.
Yeah, that's also true. We do have people looking for their seats, so I'm not sure where yours is, but we'll help with that. Let's jump in though and make the introductions around the room. I'm your friendly neighborhood chair, Dennis Roberson from Illinois Institute of Technology, and Roberson and Associates, I guess, as well. And if we could run around the room with indication, and then we'll welcome those on the phone to introduce themselves. Dale, you're up.
Dale Hatfield, University of Colorado.
David Tenenas, VMware.
Jeff Forrester with Intel.
Chuck Powers, Motorola Solutions, sitting in for Paul Steinberg.
Rangam Subramanian, NTIA.
Jack Nishelski from Qualcomm. Stephen Hayes from Ericsson.
Greg Lappin, ARRL.
Nomi Bergman with Advance.
Arvind Serbu from Carnegie Mellon University, but serving as special government employee.
Len Merrill, NTCA.
David Young, Verizon.
Russell Jurek, Cisco.
John Barnhill, Genband.
Brian Daly, AT&T.
Rob Kubik, Samsung.
Lynn Clauding, National Association of Broadcasters.
Mark Hess with Comcast.
Steve Lanning with Viasat.
Pierre DeFries, Silicon Flatiron Center here as a special government employee. John Chabin, Roberson Associates, representing the National Spectrum Consortium.
Karri Kuoppamäki, T-Mobile.
Brian Markwalter, Consumer Technology Association.
Kevin Letty, Charter Communications.
Marty Cooper, Dana LLC.
Mark Bayless, Visual Ink.
Walter Johnston, FCC, and we have a bridge open. I don't know if anybody's on their bridge. If anybody's on the bridge, would they please announce?
Hi, this is Rashmi Doshi at the FCC Lab.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else? All right, thank you.
Very good. If you could put up the agenda. Do you have it there handy?
Yeah. Put the slides up, please.
We once again have a rigorous agenda. We'll begin with a very distinguished speaker representing the FCC, and this, I'm giving this a little bit of a fun twist, but this really is a very important presentation because Walter will be sharing with us the FCC's direction around the 2016 actionable recommendations from our august body, and I think you'll be pleased to see the progress that's being made and the actions that are being taken. That certainly is what this is all about, us coming forward with things that we believe will benefit the nation through the auspices of the FCC, and they're taking action on those is really terrific. Actually, Shahid, go ahead and introduce yourself. We've just made the rounds.
Oh, nice. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shahid Ahmed, and I've been with the TAC for now almost 3 years, Walter. Is that about right? So pleasure to be here. and look forward to the discussion today.
Great. We have a number of extra tent cards. I don't know whether that was our exuberance on expectations of people who would be here or whether they're just all coming in a bit late, but we'll hopefully fill in as we go. So in terms of the agenda itself, if we could have that up on the screen.
It was up.
Okay, there we go. First, we will have the actions and recommendations. Then in order, the broadband deployment technical challenges working group, the recommendations on removal of obsolete or unnecessary technical rules, our long-standing mobile device theft prevention working group, the implications of next generation's TV broadcasting technology, aka ATSC3, and then our focus on satellite communications plan. And satellites are certainly getting a lot of focus these days, and around this table as well as in the general world. So we'll cover that one as the final one today. Each group has 30 minutes to present their progress. I will tell you, not naming names, but one of our groups has 47 slides for those 30 minutes, so we are waiting with anxious anticipation to see how that will go, but every expectation that the 30 minutes will be achieved. Those of you who feel that you don't need a full 30 minutes, that is perfectly acceptable. And we will, per Russ's question earlier, we will attempt, as we always do, to be out and about at promptly at 4 this afternoon. So with that, let's jump in, and Walt, you are on.
All right, let me just get the slides up. By the way, Julie Knapp had hoped to be here at this meeting. Unfortunately, or fortunately, he had planned a family vacation which preempts tank activities. However, there is a God of justice. Julie's vacation is in Florida. So, not perhaps the best time. Okay, we had an opportunity to sit down with the chairman and his staff. We went through the list of recommendations, specifically the 2 or 3 recommendations we held you to last year. And we discussed with the chairman a prioritization of what we could do, what he thought he wanted to focus on. And I'm going to be going over very briefly the recommendations that the chairman accepted, and at least our initial starting point. I think I want you to realize we're going to be talking about how we're going to start. Where we wind up is really going to depend upon that start and as events sort of propel us forward.
And I'm going to interject. Walter suggested that this was a single meeting. However, that is not, including meetings with the staff, that's an underestimation of the amount of interaction.
Right. One other thing I'll point out, we are given some assurance that the chairman will be available for the final meeting. Ideally, and I can't guarantee this, we would like to have him at the end of the meeting and rechange the format so that instead of writing up some list of prime recommendations, we'll have a chance to actually to present them to the chairman. So hopefully the schedule will work out in our favor, but I have a tentative commitment that he, right now, his calendar is open for the meeting. Okay. One of the recommendations last year was on software configurable radio, frequency security mechanisms. The issue there is that increasingly the radios are software controlled. There's a lot of advantages to this, but the disadvantage is that when you certify a radio to operate within a specific frequency band at specific power levels, if they can be changed at the flip of a switch, you have a potential problem. And in fact, we've had that happen in the field where radios that have been deployed have interfered with FAA-controlled Doppler radar systems. We made an initial clampdown of the software. It was done on a triage basis. We had some comment from industry and the public in terms of that hampers innovation. The value of a software configurable radio is that you can change it. And we recognize that there's an ongoing issue here, and we're looking for mechanisms that both would protect the public in terms of ensuring the radios operate only to the extent that which they're authorized, but at the same time allows innovators to change software to enhance the device as they see fit within the limits of the compliance requirements. We had some meetings with CTA, Brian Markwalter, and what we're contemplating as the recommendation is to look to an outside group, a multi-stakeholder group, to try to develop recommendations in this area. We needed somebody to start the process with. CTA graciously agreed to shoulder the burden of starting a multi-stakeholder group. I'll emphasize the objective is a multi-stakeholder group. So CTA is basically just a catalyst here in terms of starting this effort. We've been encouraged by one of the TAC recommendations. We've had some initial success with multi-stakeholder groups. They're a great way to accelerate the innovation process. We hope we can keep leveraging this, and we view this as another experiment in that area. So we're very enthusiastic about it. Okay. At the end of last year, you presented us with a number of policy statements regarding good spectrum management practices. Some of the highlights included recommendations on spectrum allocation principles, adopting risk-informed interference assessment. By the way, I'll note that the current satellite working group is incorporating risk-informed interference assessment as part of their discussions, and other policy statements. Our starting step here is to issue as a official TAC document a public notice incorporating these statements, asking for input in terms of advantages, disadvantages of incorporating these as policies, mechanisms we might use to get started in this area, maybe priorities associated with that. We're still working on a draft. Bob Pavlak is leading that. I've asked him to work with some of the TAC members in terms of getting input on what the public notice would be. But the distinguishing point here is that this will be an FCC document and the start perhaps of a policy looking at how we can incorporate these recommendations more directly into FCC efforts. Another area that we talked about was last year, and the TAC actually issued their own public notice, was on increasing levels of noise. We got a number of inputs on that. One of the recommendations that the FCC lab ought to do some testing associated with devices such as switching power supplies and advanced lighting systems. The lab is underway associated with that. Rashmi Doshi, who was on the bridge, is heading that effort. I think ultimately we'll either go forward with a notice of inquiry or perhaps even an NPRM based upon, but we're just scheduling it so that we get the lab results first and make some determination of what we should do based upon some of the data that we've accumulated. But we think there'll be some further actions beyond just the lab testing. Okay. Mobile device theft prevention, one of the recommendations last year was to build a ongoing liaison with the law enforcement industry that we could collect data in terms of, this is benchmarking in terms of theft rates, modalities of theft, trying to get a better understanding from the people who, on the law enforcement side, track these things. I think those of you who've been involved in this area know how difficult it is doing that. For one thing, there's literally 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States. Secondly, they're independent agencies, and therefore there's no central authority we can easily go to. We've tried a number of efforts, but the chairman wants to go forward in this area. Most recently, I've enlisted the help of, they volunteered, the Public Safety Homeland Security Bureau and the FCC, whose job it is to maintain liaisons with public safety. They're doing some outreach right now, and we hope later on, either later this year or early next year, we'll have a set of recommendations in terms of what we can productively do here. One thought we've had is trying to at least make an enduring relationship with maybe some of the key agencies, maybe some of the major cities that track this. Not all cities, by the way, track mobile device theft, and those that do often track it as part of a more general crime problem. So again, one of the challenges here is trying to find whether a theft is just a theft or whether a theft is a theft of a mobile device. Some of the cities, New York, Washington, San Francisco, have seen this as a special problem, and some of them are tracking this on an ongoing basis. But we're hoping to institutionalize this. We haven't yet hit on the right mode, but the chairman has said we should be doing something in this area, and we're trying to figure out what the right strategy is at this point in time. One of the recommendations made last year from the Next Generation Internet Working Group was that we ought to find out more information on user experience within the home network. Since I've been at the FCC, which is slightly more than 10 years, I've seen the evolution of internet services provided by major service providers go from less than bandwidth available in the home to many instances now exceeding the bandwidth that the home is capable of consuming. So it was only about in 2002 that the typical internet information rate was about 1.5 megabits. We're trialing, we have a program in the FCC to measure broadband performance. The highest rates we're up to are about 200 megabits. We're seeing growth in the industry at least of 40% a year. The median speeds are increasing, and common internet rates now are typically in a range of about 50 to 80 megabits per home. It doesn't say the home is capable of efficiently transporting that. I recently had the experience, as some of you know, changing apartments. I moved from the 13th floor of my apartment to the 4th floor, and I found that sitting across from my router, I could get about 4 megabits of service, even though my service provider I know is getting me 50 megabits. Switching to 5 gigahertz solved that particular problem, but the point is that we don't have too much information about how home networks are engineered, what level of equipment is being used, whether it's 10-year-old equipment operating at 802.11b, G, or N, or AC. And we should be finding out more about that. We're going to start an effort in terms of soliciting information and trying to get better data on how the home networks are operating and how they perhaps can be improved. We had one of the recommendations from TAC last year was future game-changing technology was in educating FCC staff. This is an important issue. In fact, excuse me, this is balanced spectrum. This one surprised us, frankly, because we believed we had a balanced spectrum problem, but the future game-changing technology was recommending that you establish, ensure a flow of spectrum, balanced spectrum across high, middle, and low spectrum bands for commercial use. We think we've done actually a pretty good job of this. I'll point out we've had incentive auctions at 600 and 700 megahertz. The last one, most complex auction ever at 600 megahertz. We've made spectrum available at 5 gigahertz, 1700 megahertz. We're the first country to do allocations in the millimeter band for 5G at 28 gigahertz. And we just issued a notice of inquiry on mid-band spectrum opportunities. We think this ought to be maybe the issue here and what we took away is that maybe we need to better explain what our spectrum policy is, and maybe we ought to think about how we outreach to the public in terms of what we're doing, how we're doing it, and what our priorities are. But we think we're doing what you asked. Maybe we're not explaining as well as we could, or explaining that strategy. But the strategy, when you look at what's been accomplished, is self-evident, that we've gone to all available pockets, low, middle, and high, and we've tried to make spectrum available in quantity where we can, and also balancing between the needs of licensed and unlicensed spectrum. So we're going to take this back as a work item and consider how we should better enunciate the policies that we're establishing. The other thing we're going to try to take a look at is what was recommended, a technology watch list, evolving 4G and 5G. What are our priorities in the U.S. market? I felt in my career it's always good to have a guidepost, even if the guidepost ultimately turns out to be wrong. If you're receptive to updating the guidepost, it gets you direction and momentum. So we should be doing some self-assessment in terms of, again, I think we're doing this intrinsically. It's maybe making it more explicit and making it more well-known throughout the FCC. That's the issue here. And the other recommendation we had from the Game-Changing Technology Work Group was institutional planning. There was a lot of work done. I'll be frank that some of the issues that were discussed was FCC budget constraints. We have an existing budget and we're not in an expanding budget atmosphere. The Commission is committed to this as an issue, but wanted to have the project or plan reworked in the context of what are realistic constraints on our budget and our abilities to sustain that budget for staff training. So I'll be working with Adam and Nomi in terms of what we think we can do and some of the suggestions that the commission staff made in terms of things that they would be open to. So we're going to try to take action on this, but probably in a different way than was originally recommended. All right, and I think that was it. And I think I'm within my time budget.
But you haven't received the questions and comments from those on the TAC at this point. As is our custom, if you have a question or comment, please use your tent card. And not seeing tent cards raising here. There we go.
And I've been so nice to you in the past.
Thank you, I know. I'll throw an easy one too. So, you know, in regards to the emerging technologies work that you did, specifically around 5G, we've heard some rumblings in the industry that 5G would be hindered because of the lack of fiber available for those cell sites. Did you ever come across that, or is that something the Commission is looking into?
I think it depends very much on a specific company's deployment strategy. A lot of what we've heard is that the initial rollout of 5G, at least in any scale, will be in urban areas. And we don't think that will be an issue in urban areas. It's a fundamental issue when you get to rural areas. We have consistently heard from a number of parties that access to cheap middle mile or inexpensive middle mile fiber is important. It's something the Commission is looking at in the context of programs like the Connect America Fund, Universal Service Fund. We're aware of the problem. There's a lot happening right now. So we're optimistic. I'm personally optimistic that some of the issues of the digital divide will be conquered if a fraction of what we're hearing about currently comes to pass. This seems to be a very exciting and transitional time in the technology. We're seeing proposals for a number of different approaches for how you serve the rural problem. Some of them involve satellites, some of them involve high altitude platforms, some of them might involve other forms of wireless solutions. And it's all going into sort of an arsenal of things you can deploy. So, yeah, I think fiber access can be an issue, but typically it's been associated with urban areas where you have low population densities. We haven't had companies come to us until they've got a Chicago problem or a New York problem or a San Francisco problem, but it's more when you get into less populous areas, and that's that's not a new problem, frankly.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Greetings, welcome.
Walter, you've hit the Achilles heel of this whole issue, which is getting fiber to the rural areas. Is it not at some point appropriate that maybe we can hear about the Mid-America project and other things here within the TAC, because many of us that are heavily involved in the deployment of 5G wireless communications infrastructure would like to see how you can reach those target communities. Right now, all the focus, as you stated, is on the urban centers, right? That's where buildings, urban centers, that's where we're focused. But understanding what others are thinking about from a Mid-America perspective or rural perspective might help us rethink how we roll software-based applications on these new hybrid fiber wireless infrastructures.
I'll commit. I'm not the right person to talk to on this issue, but I'll commit to talking to people in the Commission about what they can say about the Commission strategy in this area.
Okay, no problem.
And if that's of interest, I'll be happy to arrange a presentation at a future TAC meeting.
Sure.
Or an appropriate working group. Yes. That's a very good point, Jesse.
Thanks.
Don't see any other tent cards up. Anyone on the phone who has a question or comment for Walter on the FCC's actions on our actionable recommendations?
That would just be Rashmi.
Well, there may be others that have joined, as they certainly have around the table. So we'll move on then. But I think expressing on behalf of the TAC, I'm very gratified with the work that is going forward. I leaned over a couple of times to Dale since he has his fingerprints on a couple of the items that we've talked about, and others on the room I'm sure you identified personally with some of the things that where actions are taking place. But this is really great.
I'll make one other comment, and this is in deference to Pierre, who I know it sometimes. It takes a long time to prime the pump. So some of the things you advocated several years ago are starting to be put into practice and are encouraging for us. So don't get discouraged. Okay, when we do get momentum, we have a lot of momentum. So, but you should be realizing that we're playing back to you recommendations that were made some time ago. Okay, and have been refined and adapted, but the TAC continues to have input in terms of what the chairman's office takes up.
This was a good point because it did add to some of the things that are actually implicit in the response to specific action items, but they really are in reference to things that were some number of years ago. And Pierre, did you want to?
Yeah, just very briefly. Walter, your point is very well taken, and I think I take your point as actually praise. We should all be very grateful for the FCC, and you in particular, for actually taking on this project of figuring out what the recommendations were, putting them to the chairman, getting feedback. I think that's very welcome. It's wonderful to see, and I look forward to it becoming part of the process of the TAC going forward.
Thank you.
And it will be. It will be for sure. And one of the enhancements, in a sense, but it's something we've tried to do in the past, but it's having our chairman here to receive directly our actionable recommendations at the conclusion of our next meeting.
Okay, now what should be for surely the most energetic presentation of the day.
And you are on, Nomi, for broadband deployment.
Okay, and everybody's loading up on caffeine now.
Everybody buckle in.
No. Are the slides?
Slides up.
Okay.
They had to flash a picture of you
And
first before they clicked.
Oh, okay. And is there a clicker? Oh, okay.
Yeah, let me. I'll walk. We'll do Federal Express.
Look at Walter's getting steps. Thank you.
Give it to our relay runner.
Thanks, James. And you can go ahead and
the FCC Express as opposed to the Pony
go to the
Express.
next page because we'll start at just a reminder of our charter. So our charter is really to provide technology support for the BDAC, the well-publicized Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee of the FCC. That's probably, if to capture it in a nutshell, that's really our purpose here is we're trying to provide technical support for what they're trying to accomplish. So we are really trying to focus on technology questions and solutions around broadband deployment. We have a really incredible group. I'm co-chairing with Adam, who's really sorry he can't be here today, who's worked very, very hard on this, as you all know from many years of working with Adam. And we have really terrific sub-working group chairs who are going to really carry most of this presentation today. Lynn Merrill of NTCA is going to present after me, and then Marvin Serbu, special government employee and also of Carnegie Mellon, is here and has done, both Lynn and Marvin have done incredible work. And David Young, we're also pleased, has offered to help us with policy and regulations as well here. So we're very excited about that. And we've also had very heavy participation from James and Walter, as well as a lot of members of the TAC that fill 2 pages here. And so I'll let you just glance at those. We definitely thank all of them for their ideas, and there's been very good participation. I would also point out on the second page that Henning has helped us some, and then interestingly, we invited Stag Newman, who helped with the broadband plan, who was a key writer of the broadband plan, right? We invited him to participate as a speaker in one of our meetings, and he's never left. He's joined us for really at least we meet every Friday as a full working group, and then as a sub-working group we meet at another time during the week, at least twice. And Stag is on many of those calls, so also a special shout out for him. And then, as you see, we've had several others from the FCC have also helped too. This is an exam. This is a partial list of some of the subject matter expert presentations we've had. As I mentioned, we had Stagg join us. Blair Levin joined us, which was great. We had a really terrific presentation from Jonathan Chambers and Randy Clint about it was actually Lynn's going to talk about it further, so I won't steal his thunder. But I would say if you ever did want to listen to a recording of a very interesting presentation. It was one of the best I've ever heard in all of my years of these meetings and having guest speakers. And it is recorded. We could share it if people would like to see it. It was very, very helpful. And then we had a very good presentation from Corning and from Cisco, which were very thoughtful. And these were just the presentations to the whole TAC. We've had presentations to the sub-working groups as well. So we're really getting good thoughts from many, many helpful speakers. This is, I sort of already shared this. These are our 3 sub-working groups. And you're going to hear today from Lynn and Marvin, and probably next time from David. And this is just a one-page summary of the 49-page deck. So just a little bit about what we've been doing. So really, since our last meeting, we've been in listening mode, listening to technologists, looking for rural success stories. For example, one that we had a conversation with was Keene Valley in the Adirondacks. Had a very innovative group of people who found a way to raise money and build out a fiber plant in an incredibly rural part of the Adirondacks. And there are some really great stories, and there are both interesting things to learn from them from a business perspective as well as a technology perspective. We've also heard from FirstNet and Two Cows. Those were interesting. So we are seeking to learn about what are the solutions, what are the problem sets. We're trying to start to coalesce what we've learned to see if there are templates we could pull out from this. Are there templates of problem sets and their solutions that we could have ready for people who were seeking solutions. And we also are looking for emerging technologies so that we can perhaps have a view as a working group on emerging technologies to watch that could provide even more in the way of solutions in these areas. And then I think this is particularly interesting is as we look for how to organize our thoughts and recommendations, one of the things we kind of keep coalescing around, and this sounds really simple, but it actually isn't, is what are the use cases for which we're seeking solutions? So one would be rural communities that don't have service at all. So this would be, small communities that are complete broadband deserts, right? And there aren't many of those because of the Universal Services Fund fee, when you think about it. Because of the Universal Services Fund, there are very few without any service at all, right? But that's the way we think of them, but they probably have something. And then second, there are rural extensions without service. So that's just somebody who's built a street far off a main road that, again, that has no service. But I think, interestingly, most of what we talk about in terms of areas that don't have broadband service, they actually fall into this third bucket, which you could probably actually characterize into 2 buckets like the above, of communities that either just have really poor service, so they have something, but it's very, very poor, or they are a house far off, a community, 5 miles away, say, from a community that, again, has, say, a very limited, usually an ILEC service from that they're probably fortunate to have in many respects, but no, that doesn't meet the FCC's guidelines. So anyhow, you can see from that last part, it's difficult to talk about that, and then you quickly get into a discussion about the guidelines and even measurement practices. So we've had kind of gone off on all these tangents in the group to begin to talk about, well, what guidelines should be met. And So anyhow, I'm now going to pass it over to Lynn to share with you an update about our Universal Access Serving Group, which is, again, that's our working group that's looking at coverage in rural and sparsely populated and underserved areas. Thanks, Lynn.
Okay. Thank you, Nomi. For discussions as far as with Marvin and I, as we go forward, we're going to quickly kind of go through many of the slides that we have. I know that we have a tremendous amount of slides to go ahead and cover. We also have backup information that goes behind it. And the backup information really just goes ahead and covers some of the notes that we've collected as far as during these meetings. So that way you guys will have an opportunity to go back and look at those slides and then bring that forward and to be able to see where we came up with our directions that we're taking it. If we can go ahead and have the slides up. Our participants, typically we have about average of 14 people as far as on this sub-working group as far as for the universal access. There's usually 5 service providers, 4 manufacturers, 3 associates, 2 that are from academia, and then 2 others, whether consumer advocates or others, and then the FCC. So we've had a really good group that works with us and helps us to go ahead and move this forward. One of the things is I'll just go ahead and cover our problem statement as far as for the universal access. There's no single link as to why the broadband is less prevalent in the rural areas and sparsely populated areas versus the suburban and urban counterparts. And as we remember, the common threads really break with density, though other factors such as technology, service provider goals, community involvement, funding opportunities, available support play an equal and important role. And obviously we're here to support the BDAC. Now our presentations, typically, as Nomi said, we have 3 presentations as far as during a week. And we're all on all these different calls as far as we go through, because I'm pulling some information, Marvin's pulling other information, but we all need to go ahead and hear from each of the groups. So these are just a list of some of the ones that we'd pulled information from or that we will have as far as we go forward, as far as on the September 20th through the October 3rd dates, as far as for the different companies that have helped us out or put together. Connection, as far as the rural electric cooperatives, both Marv and I will talk a little bit about those. Cable Labs came in and talked to us as far as reach, as far as what they'll see. Consolidated Telephone did a partnership as far as with rural broadband for a power company, and which was quite interesting. We heard from FirstNet as far as for different areas. Hawkeye 360 provided us a presentation on RF usage, and then we had an update again as far as on the fiber to the home powering and for 5G as far as in rural areas. And just to let you know, we're really starting to move into our part where we deal with communities as far as for what communities are doing in their fiber projects, as well as looking at the FCC portion and the funding portion as far as what we can get. And Moss Adams is going to go ahead and provide that. Followed up with CenturyLink, they're going to talk about CDNs and the back office as far as for the back mile to get there. When we talked about the building scenarios, we talked about, just a build out of the new areas, extensions as far as in plan and to unserved areas from existing operations. The last thing that we had was existing operators, ones that aren't quite meeting the needs as far as for the community. But there's also one other piece to go ahead and add in here, and that deals with business disruptions. And really, when we look at business disruptions, we're thinking of revenue uncertainties and what that means as far as to the folks that are building out the rural area and how much more risk that's involved as far as for each of those. We went ahead and broke each of these down, and this is where we're trying to go ahead and move from collecting information to giving us the opportunity to go ahead and finally come up with some definitive items to go ahead and bring forward as far as to the TAC. So what we did as far as in new areas, we broke it down by construction cost, ongoing cost, partnering, revenue, and financing. When we go ahead and look at these, we went ahead and each of the groups or each of the different companies that talked gave us different line items as far as what they saw that would go ahead and help as far as reducing the incremental cost as far as for construction. And one of them is like from Cable Labs and others, we heard this as far as if there's a way to go ahead and shorten the permitting time period, that would really go ahead and expedite the operations and also reduce the cost for for construction. The electric utilities really have an advantage as far as in the power space, and Marvin's going to cover that in quite detail. And then the last thing we had as far as middle mile investment is also required, as well as last mile. And then obviously one of the parts that really helps out is if you have an opportunity to go ahead and leverage joint construction, as far as if highway construction is going on at the same time, can you go ahead and have a conduit placed in there? When you think of ongoing expenses, some of the things that could go ahead and help as far as in a new build areas, as far as if you can get some tax incentives. Another thing is if it's a city-owned pole system, can you go ahead and get maybe lower pole attachment fees? And then the other thing is, as far as from Consolidated Telephone, they were talking about billing, customer support, maintenance, as far as that is shared, as far as across all common owners, as far as for an operation. So just like anything else, the larger the scale as far as that you have, the greater the economies that you go ahead and get as far as in back office expenses. Reducing the back office expenses obviously cuts the operating costs, which gives you a greater distance that you can go ahead and move out in the rural area. When we look at from the revenue standpoint, we had several people talk about the NCTC as far as being key as far as in cutting the content cost as far as or the cost to go ahead and acquire content. Also, the other thing that was discussed by many was the pre-commitments and long-term contracts. Being able to get those was significant as far as for each of the groups. And then also being able to establish or set up the anchor institutions, and then as you're going down a route to be able to go ahead and get the backhaul as far as for wireless organizations. Financing was a major issue that a lot of folks had talked about. And this payback period was something that was real interesting. For cooperatives and then for locally owned companies, they were looking at 18, 20 years as far as for the payback as far as on systems. Yet for other carriers, as far as maybe a little bit larger carriers, they have a much shorter time frame as far as for that, which really kind of changes the payout as far as for build and payout for a system. So that was just something that we saw that was interesting. Municipalities, as far as bonding, when they go through and if they build a system, they can go ahead and bond for it, and they can go ahead and get lower interest rates as well. And then the last thing under financing is the, either state funding as far as it might be able to be gotten, CAF as far as for support, or grants, loans and grants. When we look at existing plant and unserved areas, I'm going to go ahead and go a little bit quicker as far as through these. You have your cost. But remember, this is an incremental cost as far as just connecting that last mile. You already got the middle mile all built, and you're talking about that last little line down there, and then the drop, and then the CPE equipment. Still holds true as far as for electric companies as far as use of their power space. In some cases, you may be able to go ahead and get aid for construction when you're building someplace. You say, it's just too far for us to build, but if you house owner, want to kick in a couple dollars here and there to go ahead and help cover this, then they can go ahead and be able to make that economical to go ahead and build. Obviously, this isn't for any place where you have support mechanisms that are in place, but it could be used as far as on individual cases, although we've been finding it's very hard to figure out how to monetize it as far as to drag it forward and to use it as far as for a build to scale. And then the other thing is working with other infrastructure projects as far as during construction, obviously the same as what we had before. Ongoing cost, there's a few incentives that you can get, but one of the things is as you add more customers on, then you get to go ahead and spread that fixed cost as far as across all the different users. Revenues, there is, any revenue you get is incremental. It goes ahead and supports, but it has to support each of the additions. And then one of the great things is being able to have good techniques as far as to do pre-sign-ups, which goes ahead and gets an upfront service as far as in demand as far as covering that. Again, you have financing the same as what you had before. Now, when we're talking about areas that are existing operators, and this is where they have services below the guidelines or 25.3 megabits as far as what we'd kind of picked as far as today to go ahead and use. One of the things is we've got to look at, how do you determine if it's really a poor service as far as in the community? Part of it is to look at speed tests. You could use crowdsourcing as far as for data, as far as, this street has good service, this one doesn't, as far as from that. And then also the mapping. With the development of the mapping tools and some of the things that goes ahead and will help by the FCC as well. Now, how do you solve these issues as far as by a community basis? Well, you could look at assist as far as with upgrades, or the community could look at assist as far as with overbuilds of existing plant. And the other thing is the community just to go ahead and construct their own facilities. And you can kind of read through each of these different ones, but if you go through and you go ahead and have an upgrade with an existing plant, then you could do tax incentives, you could help with grants. I mean, you could do all sorts of things. Or if they needed backhaul, they could go ahead and help as far as with the backhaul, or be a major tenant as far as along the system. If you're assisting with the overbuild of an existing community as far as plant, then what you're doing is you're looking outside. So you're going to the town next door, you're going to someone else to go ahead and say, hey, we need you to come over here and help build this town because the existing company that's here serving isn't going to go ahead and wants to be a part of it as we're going forward. So the community has the largest voice as far as in being able to do this, and by them coming in or going someplace and asking, it kind of opens up the door as far as to bring that forward. And then the last piece is as far as for the community, as far as construction along its own facilities. And that's where they go in and build the network themselves, or they partner with a regional service provider to go ahead and to use the facilities after it's already built. I'll just mention the disruption as far as for revenues as service. Obviously, we mentioned it beforehand, long-term revenue streams are needed to support the rural areas. If you lose these services or you lose the revenues long-term, you're going to have an extreme amount of hardship as far as across the board with that. One of those could be triple play if you lost the video or voice as far as along that. Or if you lost support, as far as if you were getting USF support and it goes for 10 years and then it drops off and then you have a loan for 18 years, that becomes a problem as far as continue to be able to pay that off. Looking for new revenue sources, obviously applications within the city. If the city has some applications that can be used amongst the customers, meter reading or other public safety devices, that will go ahead and help improve revenues. The last thing, or one of the things I want to mention was dealing with the service provider structure. And this is one of the things we were finding out. Cooperatives, they have a vested interest in serving everyone that's a part owner as far as for them. So they serve both the high density and the very low density as far as for their service area. That means that they're going to take on a higher economic risk as far as with long-term paybacks. The local providers, as far as someone that lives within the community, they're there and they live there and they associate with everyone, so they have an interest as far as going ahead and continuing that high economic risk as far as for that long payback. Now, when you look at the community-owned networks, they're there to fill in the gaps. This is in areas where you have non-performing broadband providers that are there. So they have a vested interest to go ahead and grow the community, attract new business, and expand the tax base. So when they look at going ahead and building a broadband network, they can weigh what the costs are to build a network and the risk that goes against it as far as for these other areas that they get the growth in as far as from the community, the businesses, and the taxes. So there's a little bit of a trade-off that they get that's somewhat different than what you get as far as from the local provider or the cooperatives. When you think of the regional providers, they're interested in serving the customers as far as deep as they can remain economical. So there is... for the long-term risk, as far as for extension, it becomes a little bit harder and more difficult for them to go ahead and to fund and to take care of because of the short-term funding that they might see. If it was 8 years or 6 years that they get, well, that's not like 18 years out there as far as dealing with that. The next thing that I want to cover real quickly is where we're moving forward. Obviously, we're trying to go ahead and build our box to where it gives us a game plan to go ahead and work from. We have guidelines for people to look at and support to go ahead and take forward. Since we're still trying to get our last couple of pieces together as far as with this, we'll have the Universal Service Fund to go ahead and look at it, our U.S. loan program, and difference as far as from funding. Another thing is that we're trying to get a better understanding as far as for the build-outs, because as far as for FirstNet, Massachusetts Broadband Initiative indicated that they were getting 10 cell sites that were going to be built out in their area, which would go ahead and help cover the rural. We're trying to go ahead and work with AT&T to see what that might look like on a national level as far as what they might be providing or building out in the rural areas, which would go ahead and help us to understand how much deeper it might go. And of course, we're looking at developing the list or getting the list as far as companies that are out there doing partnerships as far as across the United States or locally, and to be able to list those. And then to better identify, where broadband service is today and how to go ahead and track where we see broadband as far as going. And I think one of the main things is that the real estate industry would be involved in that. That would be a big plus as far as across the United States to be able to understand. And then also for the rural agriculture associations to do that. We're working on the business models as far for munis, and then give some use case and other success stories to go ahead and build in there. And then to go ahead and build some sort of simplified matrix, but we haven't really gotten to figure out how to make that one work, but to build a matrix that we can use as a playbook for others to go ahead and begin that process. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Marvin.
So in trying to develop a broadband technology roadmap, we're not trying to talk about all of the changes that are coming up and all the different technologies for broadband. Many are designed to provide higher bit rates and more density in urban areas, which are capacity challenged. This is not the problem in rural areas. So we're focusing on only those technologies which enable us to deploy in fairly low density, underserved areas. And in considering these technologies, we're looking both at the current capabilities and their ability to evolve over time as user demands for higher data rates continue to evolve. So we started by trying to develop a model of where the costs are in deploying a broadband system. There are significant costs which are the first year initial first capital costs. There are others that are the annual or operating costs, and trying to identify the critical cost components in each of these areas where new technology might lower the costs in order to enable deployment in currently high-cost areas. We identified in particular the importance of for fixed technology, fixed wireline technologies, the cost of simply stringing the cable, whether it's aerial or underground. Aerial plan in particular, there are huge costs associated with make-ready and pole replacement. We've seen estimates of as high as 50% of the cost per mile of running a cable is make-ready and pole adjustment. And we also looked at powering and other things which are part of the ongoing costs of broadband and what technologies may reduce those things. Next slide. So for wired technologies, the primary approaches are either fiber to the home or hybrid fiber coax. The telcos are no longer investing in DSL, except for rare exceptions such as AT&T's recent deployment of GFast in urban apartment buildings. But for rural areas, we're not seeing extensions of DSL. And even for the cable plant, where they're doing a new build as opposed to simply an extension around an existing community, they're building essentially fiber to the home or fiber to the curb with perhaps coax only for the last drop and essentially a optical fiber coax interface per household. So it looks a lot like fiber to the home. And so we're really talking here about stringing fiber if you're building new plant in an unserved area. Obviously, either approach of GPON or DOCSIS provisioning over EPON or traditional HFC with a very short coax drop are scalable to very high bit rates over time, so that's not a concern. So as I suggested, the biggest part of the cost tends to be the plant construction. For aerial construction, the pole make-ready costs, we heard from different parties that the costs were anywhere from 25 to 50%. So if you can substantially reduce those costs, you can make a significant dent. So we heard, for example, from electric utilities who can put ADSS fiber in the power space and much closer to the power lines than a typical communications cable. And this dramatically reduces the make-ready costs because you don't have to rearrange all of the lines on the pole or put in new larger poles. And for example, Cable Labs told us it was $35,000 to $65,000 per mile for aerial deployment, whereas rural electric co-ops were telling us it was $18,000. And that's largely got to be the savings that they can realize in pole make-ready. We're also seeing advances in underground deployment, advances in slit trenching and direct buried fiber. We heard last year from Google Fiber that part of their reason for rethinking their fiber deployment was to move away from aerial and towards underground as being cheaper, in part because you don't have to deal with all the delays associated with make-ready costs. We heard that some utilities are so overburdened now with make-ready costs being imposed on them by the wireless companies as they string more fiber for backhaul to their wireless towers that they don't have time to devote the resources to the requests from small communities who want to do broadband. The other technologies relevant here are reductions in fiber handling and splicing costs and long-reach optoelectronics. We heard from Corning that they're developing smaller cables with similar numbers of fibers. Smaller diameter cables allow you to get more cable per reel, which means that on a long reach you don't have to do as much field splicing because you can get more miles of cable on the reel. And so that's a real significant advantage. And fast splice approaches from ribbon cables and the like also can reduce deployment costs of fiber. Next slide. So with respect to middle mile and OPEX costs, middle mile capacity requirements are strongly affected by the location of CDNs. So if the CDN is located at the nearest NFL city and you've got to backhaul over your middle mile all the traffic from the CDN, that's a lot of demand on your middle mile. If the CDN can be located within the community, all that traffic disappears from the middle mile. That can be a significant savings if you're paying per megabit per second to a middle mile provider. If however, you've run your own fiber in the middle mile, actually increasing the capacity over it is relatively cheap, and the need for locating a CDN close to the end user is reduced. We're also seeing that increasing reliability of field electronics is reducing truck rolls, and that's reducing operating expenses. We then considered a variety of wireless technologies. There are many flavors of wireless that are being used by wireless ISPs today and major operators: fixed LTE, Wi-Fi, WiMAX, TV white spaces, LTE via balloons. We were fortunate to hear from we also know that there's significant work in beamforming antennas using massive MIMO. This allows higher signal-to-noise ratio, which means greater reach from a single tower, and potentially up to 10 times the throughput at a single tower through greater spatial reuse of spectrum. And that means that a single tower can serve a much larger rural area where your coverage, you're not capacity limited. Although greater throughput at the tower is going to mean greater backhaul capacity demand from either fiber or wireless. The challenge with wireless and using these techniques to their fullest is that as consumer usage increases, how do you scale that wireless demand? And you have to go back and build more towers anyway. So you have lots of continuing ongoing capital investment. It's not a one-time thing. Next slide. We heard from David Reed of the University of Colorado, who had done a comparison of a variety of wireless technologies for rural areas that happened to be in South America. But it was interesting because it was on comparable terms an examination of some of these different techniques. The best roadmap that they identified was initially providing LTE via balloons when take-up is low and the desired bit rate is low, but because it's hard to subdivide cells when you're using balloons, it doesn't scale as demand increases, and eventually you need to migrate to terrestrial fixed LTE as the demand increases. And so their cost estimates showed that where they assumed a certain increase in penetration and an increase in required bit rate over a 10-year period, that after about 5 years, balloons, which were the lowest cost initially, simply couldn't increase capacity enough because you couldn't subdivide the cells, and that over the longer term, LTE was going to be the lowest cost solution. But they did also identify that the cost varied considerably from region to region, and so these are, you have to do case-specific analyses. Finally, the continuing work of the group, we're going to look at low Earth orbit satellite approaches, coordinating with the satellite group, and we want to better understand wired versus wireless trade-offs. We're going to hear more from Microsoft about white spaces, and that's where we intend to go going forward. Thank you.
Did you have wrap-up comments? Naomi, or no?
No, we want to ask for questions. We can take questions.
You can take questions.
Okay, very good.
Yeah, we would welcome them. Thank you.
A lot of material that we've just gone through. So this is your opportunity to probe and get. Steve, you're first.
Okay. Lynn, when you were talking about reducing content costs, a big chunk of that ecosystem involves ad sales, which often offset those content costs. So it occurred to me that you might consider some kind of shared sales channel, because there are also economies of scale in doing that. In fact, the cable operators do that on a regular basis to match up DMAs with broadcast TV.
Do you want me to answer that?
That's a good point. No, if you want to.
I mean, well, I would just say that one of the things that we found is that many of these innovative efforts where people have taken it upon themselves to build out a solution in a community or overbuild a solution in the community, sometimes a little bit of both, they often use the resources of cooperatives like NCTC. I'm sure there's others. And so through those, they can get to a channel for reduced programming cost. So that's what we've seen so far as a best practice. You know, I have to say, just from being involved with various ad sales efforts in cable, I think it would be really hard to solve both the broadband challenge and the ad sales challenge for that same operator. But it's interesting, it's innovative. So, but I think the cooperative, we are finding more people are using that, not just for programming, but also for equipment and other any kind of procurement.
Great. Mm-hmm. Other questions or comments? Oh, too close, Walter.
Yeah, I was interested in your comparison of electric utility costs versus cable company versus, say, micro trenching. In the light of recent events with disasters, is it possible to factor in reliability costs? It strikes me that in rural areas, which often in a disaster like a hurricane where the cable becomes at risk, would micro-trenching offer an offset in terms of reliability? Issue there, and I have no experience in this, normally when you dig cable, you put it at a depth where it's secure, and therefore it's a more reliable solution as opposed to over the air. Micro-trenching is built near the surface. I'm not sure what I haven't seen reliability statistics on micro-trenching, but my point is you're looking at economics sort of from a benign environment, and there's a different set of economics for a non-benign environment, and it'd be useful at least to raise that as an issue, if nothing else.
According to some informal comments from Milo, talking about Google Fiber, what they found is that the reliability of microtrenching in terms of fiber cuts from backhoes is about the same as the reliability from cars running into phone poles or trees falling on the wires. So it's not there's not a significant improvement.
Well, by the way, I did a tour of outside plant once in New England, and I was told that the frequency at which cars run into poles is very highly correlated with the number of bars and saloons in the area.
It's great to have this tidbit of information that Walter shares.
Need a saloon tax.
Walter, you did bring up a good point as far as talking about like the hurricanes and things like this, because usually with microtrenching, it usually goes down like the sidewalk or something like that, so it's fairly protected as far as dealing with that. But years ago, and I don't remember exactly when it happened, but so RUS allowed everything to be aerial, and then they had a hurricane go through and it just wiped out all the plant. And then going forward, everything had to be buried, and if you wanted to put something in the air, you had to go ahead and describe why it was going to be aerial as far as from their standpoint. And now all of a sudden it's kind of moving back that other way, that they look at the cost and they say, gee, is it worth the extra cost as far as being buried versus being in an aerial? But to me, is if you get a chance to go ahead and bury it and put in extra ducts, you're well ahead. Anything than being in the air. But for a lot of things, when you look at the economics as far as try to build quick, try to go ahead and get something in, you run into that. Although I know in some of the conversations that we had amongst people that depending on where it is and if the ground's decent soil, by the time they add in the cost for the pole rental, they add in all the long-term costs, that they're seeing that the buried's just about the same as what the aerial is. So the interesting point, yeah, very much so. And we'll have quite a bit more on that when we get to our end.
It's only tangentially relevant to the question, but my department did a study for Florida Light and Power on the value of burying their electric utilities versus replacing them in every hurricane, and concluded that despite the costs of all those people down there in Florida right now, it's cheaper to replace it than it is to bury it.
Mm-hmm. I would say, though, because we were an operator in Florida, you have to think about it competitively, though, too. You might not have to if you're Florida Power and Light, but you have to if you're a cable company or if you're Verizon. So there's a cost to losing customers, too. Sure. So we did think of it competitively. So I think your question's a really good one, Walter. So it's not just about providing access. And, we've looked at things like how the quality of the access because of, say, CDN connectivity, but the quality of access in terms of how the plant is built, in terms of how reliable it will be, is interesting too. So probably you're right. In the most rural of areas, we're taking shortcuts on all those things. So it's an interesting thing to be thinking about here. It is. Good point. Mm-hmm.
Dale.
I have just a minor comment, and I apologize because I've actually participated in some of the meetings, and maybe perhaps I should have raised it there. But if I remember back in the old telephone company days, which I do, there was something called a line extension charge. It was very common. And I think they're still very common in the electric utility industry today. And it seems to me as we're trying to do more to support broadband, this notion of a line extension charge, I think, might transfer over rather nicely. And wonderful internet here. I went to the Big Bend Telephone Company tariff, and if you've been to Big Bend, it's probably an isolated area you'd ever want to imagine, and they have line extension charges as part of their existing tariff offering. So I don't know exactly how that fits in, but I didn't hear us using the term line extension where the customer makes a contribution. And I'll just make one more point. In Colorado, you see people who build beautiful homes up on top of the mountain, and they spend tens of thousands of dollars to bring the road up there. And it just seems to me, I don't understand why we'd want to subsidize somebody like that when a line extension charge, I'm not suggesting means test perhaps, but it seems to me that it would be perfectly reasonable to have them contribute to the cost of the cost of extending service in that situation.
So, Dale, I think we're using when you said line extension, we're using the same term as far as when we go say aid to construction. That's the same. So it just depends on what area you're in and what you're looking at as far as for that.
When you're old as I am.
Yeah. Yeah. So definitely, I think an aid to construction is something to consider. I know in certain circumstances, depending on where you get your funding, if you get a grant or if you get loan, and depending on where it is, they may allow you to do that, or they may say, no, since you're taking this money at a lower rate, you have to bill to everybody and connect them.
It'd be interesting to look at those policy issues
Yeah.
to see that those might be adjustable in a changing world.
There's some application to the dig once notion when you're building those roads. Jesse?
Yeah, I was wondering if the group, typically TCO for these rural areas is always a major challenge. I was wondering if you looked at this whole idea of urban areas adopting rural areas as a subsidy scheme to try and help facilitate rolling out infrastructure in the rural areas, particularly the new hybrid fiber wireless infrastructure, given that there's tremendous value in urban areas, which is where we're focused at. But if somehow we could find the right urban areas matching them to the right rural areas, it may open up a whole new space to explore how you can reduce the cost for rural areas. It's just a thought, right? I was wondering if you looked at that.
Yeah, so one of the things is when you talk about support as far as for the rural areas, that's where you go ahead and combine or collect sources as far as for revenues that are set aside to go ahead and to use that, so that the person that's on the farm can go ahead and sell their cattle as far as to the person that's doing the trading at Kansas City or someplace like that. So that's just an example as far as for that. And so yes, that goes on, and yes, that's something for everybody to consider as far as taking forward. The other part too that I like as far as when you're talking about the 5G, as far as getting it extended as far as to the communities. If you're in a town that doesn't have fiber to the home already as far as broadband, and some of these areas already have fiber to the home in the town, it's just once you leave town, it really drops as far as the type of service that you have. So that's the trade-offs as far as trying to go ahead and get there. But if they didn't have it, coming in and building a 5G network to go ahead and serve the town looks like something that would be a technology to consider as far as in very much detail. And it's just is that you still have to put the fiber up to be able to serve those areas, or to use the coax plan as far as in those areas to go ahead and serve it. So it's a great technology, for us to look at and to consider. So we'll definitely do that as we move forward to the year.
The only reason I mention it, if I go back to my many years in cellular, in the early days, I hate to sound like that, but in the early days, we had these communities that sort of set in between, which are rural areas that set in between these urban centers that we were building out new digital cellular radio. And that we found that advantageous to keep satisfied customers by filling in the gaps, right? And aiding in filling in the gaps, which made cellular much more attractive at the beginning in terms of car phones, and ultimately transitioning into digital cellular, which I was involved in. So I just thought it was something that, with this whole new thrust toward hybrid fiber wireless networking, maybe a great opportunity now to start having that type of dialogue where it may be some interest there. I don't know.
Yeah, I like the thought. We'll follow up with you after. I think it's innovative. Sure. It's interesting to think about. And I like Dale's thought also. I mean, that's essentially, to Dale's thought on the extensions, the line extension charge. That is essentially what this Keene Valley did, where they knocked on doors around town and said, hey, will you pitch in? It is, and I know it happens at cable companies too, or sometimes the company will say, well, we can't really build that unless, can you help us at all, right? Yeah. So we'll look for examples of that. That's interesting. Good feedback, everybody.
Very good. Thank you for the group and for all the input, and look forward to the continuing contributions there. We'll move on to recommendations for removing obstacles or unnecessary technical rules. Russ and John show. Beginning now.
Slides?
Okay, so this is recommendations for removing obsolete and unnecessary technical rules. My name is Russ Jurek, and my co-chair next to me, John Barnhill from GenBand. We have a number of FCCA liaisons, And if you take a look at our team member, I think we have a very representative group of individuals on the team that represent a broad spectrum and bring a great deal of value to the discussion. So we've simplified the working group mission, and some of this is a little bit of review. We covered this in June, but just want to make sure people are aware. The goal of this working group is to reduce the friction of working with the FCC. Looking at specific regulations, not an overview of all regulations, but trying to get input from multi-stakeholders, from the FCC, and identify a list of top areas to focus on. We've also reached out to standards bodies and trying to look at some of the industry impacts of some of the rules. And we'll get into some detail on the preliminary recommendations around some of these. So the fundamental question for the telecommunication industry that we came up with as a team, and again, some of these are a little bit of review, how should the Commission deal with the sunset of legacy technologies? We've seen a number of these technologies sort of die off in the last 10 years. Also, should regulations have some sort of sunset clause when they're enacted, a time to life, so to speak? And the other main point here is what principles should guide decision-making through these transitions? So we've also identified, that there are enduring values that the FCC brings, and these are important and steer the working group as we look at burdens to overcome. Those include public safety, universal access, competition, consumer protection, plus the protecting of the commons, which was one that was added. And again, how do we achieve all these principles while promoting innovation and growth in the industry? So feedback summary from the various organizations we've talked to over the past, 8 months now. Process for working with third-party organizations, i.e. how do organizations engage? What are the guidelines? We have some examples we'll share. Also, reporting requirements continually come up in terms of the amount of paperwork, even if it's online paperwork. The technology focus within the FCC. Certification burdens, and we'll share a number of examples there, testing examples, current state of certification, as well as some proposals on what we'd like to see happen next potentially. Work activities through the second quarter, which means basically our summer vacation. We reviewed the current FCC actions seeking to reduce and simplify. That was a technical inquiry, ET docket 17-215. Continued stakeholder engagements. We did meet with a number of industry associates, standards bodies, equipment manufacturers, public interest groups, and commission staff. We also talked about next-gen policy, creating a framework proposal on how to leverage third parties, and we'll share that in the preliminary recommendations. Some of those industry engagements are, the stakeholder organizations are listed on the left that we've met with: Encompass, TIA, CTIA, ADIS, NTCA, Intel, CES, or Consumer Technology Association, the FCC. And we've got additional engagements lined up for the next couple months, which will also really beef up some of the input and feedback that we have as a working group to focus on some of the key burdens or areas of work. The summary or key themes that we've got from these industry leaders and industry organizations: reporting burdens on small companies, and we've got a list of a couple companies, although there are a couple organizations, it's not limited to these organizations listed in the sub-bullets on any of these. Certification requirements for devices, there were a number of folks, and that one's we'll get to the point of that's becoming a sub-working group on its own. Standards and third-party engagements, a lot of organizations weighing in on input there. One of the big areas that one of our big accomplishments for this past quarter, we did issue a public notice, and on reforming technical regulations. It was picked up in the media quite well, and Greg Laffin will walk through the summary of what that public notice asks, and the 2-month time period where we'll gather that feedback and some of the initial feedback from, I think the only feedback we have right now is from amateurs, listed as amateurs right now. But Greg, if you want to take over, I'll keep the clicker and move the slides.
Okay, thank you. We have a little experience with public notices from last year, so we thought it was a good idea to try it again. This is just the first page of the public notice. then Walter was instrumental in getting this thing out.
Went like clockwork.
We really appreciate his help. It did not look like an easy process, and after dealing with every part of the FCC, it wasn't an easy process. But we tried to include everyone's sensibilities, and we think we have something that will make everybody happy. Next. We started with an introductory paragraph where we introduced the TAC and its purpose. You might notice the profusion of the word technical, but let me just explain that was a compromise. Parts of the FCC did not want us to delve into non-technical aspects, and I fully agree with that. In the next slide, we start asking questions. What kind of things do we want people to answer? And the first obvious question is, what, if there are any that people know of, what specific regulations would they like to see removed? And then, of course, after you ask that question, you have to ask them, if you're going to remove it, what do you want to replace it with? The counterpoint to that question is also, are there any regulations out there that you think should be retained? Are they serving a good purpose right now? Are they protecting your signal? Are they improving the purpose of the FCC to promote competition, to regulate unlicensed frequencies so that everybody can use them? Or things that the FCC has to comply with, like international agreements? And the FCC has a purpose, and many of its regulations are for that purpose. So we're giving people a chance to retain regulations that others might want to get rid of. There are also regulations that might be necessary, but they have requirements in them that are no longer valid. Mostly that was because we got many complaints about reporting requirements. Many people in the industry think that they're overly burdensome. So we're asking them, can we modify those regulations, which are necessary, but tone down some of the burdensome aspects? And there are many possible ways to tone them down. We'd just like to get their opinions on how to do it. Next slide. In addition to specific regulations, we also thought to ask about comments on how to update FCC policies. When conflicts, for instance, exist between different FCC-regulated parties, how can these be resolved without the current slow process of using the FCC to do that? So we're asking people to see if they have any better ideas, if they're not getting along with their neighbor, how can they resolve that conflict rather than coming to the FCC and then having to supply the FCC with all the information that the FCC requires to understand the problem, and then letting the FCC play the role of a judge. Another possibility for reducing regulations is to combine or duplicative ones. For instance, if there are multiple forms of communication, each with its own regulation, and they're all describing the same thing, can we just combine them all and make a single regulation? Next slide. One area of interest that might be able to greatly simplify many FCC regulations is to somehow have the regulations reference widely accepted industry standards. So instead of the FCC writing regulations with all the details of how a radio service should work, that radio service presumably is following a standard, and the FCC could just reference that standard. Now that sounds very simple, but there are many potential pitfalls to doing that. And those include the potential conflict between the regulatory process, which include NOIs and NPRMs, and extensive comments and reply comments that the entire public is able to participate in. versus industry standard bodies, which often have more closed proceedings. They often require expensive memberships to comment in the standard development process. And very often, the standards require expensive subscriptions in order just to read them. So how do we make a standard like that comply with all of the things that have to be done when the FCC makes a regulation? And I asked the question, but that's the question we're asking people to comment on. So it certainly does sound like a good idea to just let the FCC use standards, but it's not as simple as it sounds. Also, the standards get updated. And how can we fold the update process into the FCC regulatory process? Next slide. We're also looking for comments on how processes used by the FCC can be improved. Some of our suggestions are to comment on the use of multi-stakeholder groups, which have been used by the FCC recently with great efficacy. And anything else that anyone comes up with, we welcome them to submit. Mainly, if a new technology or service comes out, how can the people who want to use that technology and service get the FCC up to speed on that and help them to write the regulations for that? Now, some of the public notice that published this technical inquiry was put on the FCC website on August 30th. And we've set a deadline of October 30th, about 60 days, for comments. Comments can be directly entered on the FCC Electronic Comment Filing System, ECFS. And you can do that by going to www.fcc.gov and clicking on the ECFS icon, or Walter likes to just use Google. But both of them work. And you can actually
or Bing. We're totally non-technically biased.
Or Yahoo, or. Yeah.
But you could also just type www.fcc.gov/ECFS and get there. Once you're there, all you have to do is enter our docket number, which is 17-215, in the specify proceeding field. And once you've done that, you click on search, and you're right there. The ECF system is really, well, over the years, I can tell you it's much improved. And they really have come up with something good that I think is very easy to use. However, no matter how easy it is to use, there are those who don't want to use it. And so we've received emails as well. To date, we've received 3 responses on the ECFS and 4 responses by email, all from radio amateurs. And all of them are related to updating rules in Part 97 of the FCC regulations. Before I was even able to inform ARRL that this proceeding was out there, they had already written a news article about it. And that's probably where a lot of these comments have come from. But as Walter says, in past experience, the vast majority of the replies come right at the end. So we're looking forward, now that you all know how to go to ECFS, if you want to help us, please do. And we certainly would love to have more things than we can read. But by October 30th, we'll be busy reading and categorizing and figuring out what people want to see. And by the December meeting, we'd like to present that. So,
great.
Can we see if there's any questions about that before we move on? We showed the essential 7 questions that are built into the notice.
Questions around the table or on the phone? Hearing none.
Okay.
I think
we'll proceed then. We started to put together the recommendations, and we've been having this running dialogue about the role of the commission and should they get more engaged with standards, definition organizations, and industry associations. that are actively working in these areas, defining new technologies going forward. And nobody said it was a horrible idea. Generally, there was a view that if the commission wanted to participate in these things, that their participation and guidance would be welcome. In general, the bias on the working group is towards consensus-based standards and less towards regulation. So the more that the industry can come together and align themselves that way around a specific technological direction, that's a good thing. And direct participation would create more context and better understanding of the real-world deployment of these technologies. The one thing that Walter has said a couple of times here is that industry is better able to make the trade-offs between business and technical considerations. And I thought that was an important thing that that the commission may not see until way late in the process if they're waiting until the end to get involved in that. So the different standards organizations, we've been very lucky to have participation from TIA, from ADIS so far. In fact, we added a gentleman, Mike Navraki, over here sitting in the gallery. He's the CTO for ADIS, and he started participating in all of our calls. And they've done a lot of good work that they shared with us on working with industry and governmental bodies to set standards. We think there's an opportunity to leverage that work more. They've got a template that seems to work, as does TIA. TIA has a bit more limited role in the standards, specific to some of the things we're looking at, but they're still very interested in being part of that organization. The industry associations that we talked to included TIA, we got NTCA, we had presentations from CTIA, and no one was more vigorous in their feedback to us than the representatives of the Small Company Coalition, who were extremely passionate in their interface and wanting everybody to understand just how challenging it is to stay compliant as a small company. All right. The slides aren't up, but
Put the slides up, please.
some of the things we talked about as we were considering what would that need to look like if they were going to be, if the commission is going to pick and choose where they decide to participate. Whatever happens, the process has to be open, and it's got to allow fair representation from a wide range of industry participants. And those organizations who are coordinating those types of efforts need to make sure they're always reaching out to bring in the broadest possible group of people. And then, as Greg alluded to, the high cost of a standard in a case like this is something that we think is not really conducive to having the commission involved. So we think the output of the work activity needs to be accessible to everybody who has an interest in that. One of the things that we understand is that in the absence of involvement from the commission, the standards bodies are going down a certain technical path, and the commission can serve, when they get involved, to focus the efforts a bit more. We think that the process should be as collaborative as possible within the constraints of the legislation that the commission is working with. And one of the things that we really wanted to emphasize is that if you're going to be in this type of work, it requires an investment of manpower and budget to be able to participate and be fully participating organizations. And I know that Walter's already alluded to the fact that the commission is not in the headcount adding or the expense adding part of their mission today. But if this is something that you intend to do, it's very hard to do it sitting from back in your office. You've got to be there participating in that process to have the influence that you should probably have. We've got some examples that have used an open process. One that I was involved in, it's actually the last on the slide, was the robocalling and the caller ID initiative. That really started with a collection of companies who knew we needed to do something about that. And under the auspices of ADIS and the SIP Forum, we used some existing committee structures to pull together some work items on that. But that was only part of it. At the same time, the FTC and the Commission, the FCC, were both involved because of the high visibility of the issue. And so that really became two parallel paths that were working towards solving a problem from different perspectives that were going along their own paths. But when the Commission got involved, particularly last year when Chairman Wheeler asked Randall Stevenson to lead the strike force on robocalling, the industry totally focused on that, and the normal timetables that everybody were going through were all accelerated because of that involvement. Some of the other examples are on there. Last year or the year before, there was competing interest around Wi-Fi and the LTE standard LAA, and the Commission got involved there just to ask tough questions. And once the tough questions were asked and a strong shove, I think, was also delivered, the industry participants got together to come up with a solution that was acceptable to others. Emergency alerts. ADIS worked with governmental organizations to come up with that policy, and it's become the template of what's used. Now, another example that comes up quite often is the DTV transition. And that's distinguishable in that it also had money to affect the consumer transition with the funding of devices for the end consumer. But all these would represent different flavors of this same principle where the Commission or other government organizations are working with private organizations to advance a policy standard that, or a technical standard that accelerates the normal pace of regulation. So I think the timeline is now, yeah, you can just look at that. That's just showing a sort of a history of the robocalling issue. On the top are the ADISIP forum actions, and on the bottom are the governmental actions that happened. And really, the whole engagement from the IETF was really driven by Henning when he was the CTO here at the FCC. All right, keys to success. If the FCC has a technical plan, they should publish that. They should make sure that the industry understands what your priorities are, as well as what the individual company's priorities are. We think that would help to shape some of the outcome that we're looking for here. And then the different focus areas should shape the selection of the stakeholders. So if we're going to be going after a certain technology that work within the context of those industry experts that are already in that area, and bring in the necessary consumer advocates or business advocates to make sure that all the factors are being considered. In general, I'll leave it with this. Staffing and appropriate funding for that staff to participate is the only way that you would transition to this more collaborative model as opposed to the regulation. Nobody on the committee wants preemptive regulation, but a lot of people are interested in coming up with agreements for how the industry can move forward together. That's it.
Great. So I'll cover the certification sub-working group. Again, this one's really kicked off August 3rd. We had a great presentation that Intel shared their views on certification and some of the burdens. In the meantime, we've had several additional meetings, including with Rashmi Doshi at the FCC and a number of the players listed here, and we'll continue to drive towards some specific recommendations related to certification process. So just the key areas we're exploring right now related to certification, moving towards, these are things that are on the table, move towards more self-certification, explore a potential grading system that would provide vendors with certain freedoms or additional self-certification capabilities. Is there a need for an NOI to be issued? What about the formation of a workshop with multi-stakeholders to drive a new process related to the certification process? Harmonization of international standards is obviously a key one. Impact of IoT in terms of grants and certification needs. There's some disagreement between different groups right now on whether there will be an impact or not, with a large number of new devices coming onto the network. Update certification program to include the SDOC for some radios. And then 2.803 and 2.805, there's some issues related to marketing that are basically quarantined by the FCC during the certification process. The output we really plan to get to is to propose a phased program for change. And the next slide has much more detailed, I would say, directional recommendations as to what we're driving for certification barriers. So review and update Part 2.803 and 2.805, the marketing rules, as I mentioned. Review and update Part 15.31H for composite systems as the rules are outdated. At least that's the opinion of some. Work to complete NOI 13-84 on RFE and interim update power density average area to 20 centimeters squared greater than 6 hertz, or gigahertz, sorry. And work to complete open issues in NPRM 15-170, including permissive changes, module approval, and other open issues. Set up work group to look at issues restricting the expansion of SDOC for low-power wireless devices. Consider the adoption of internationally developed standards such as EMC and RFE testing standards in general. Update experimental license webpage to make it more user-friendly. And allow experimental licenses under the program, experimental license to file confidential reports to keep research confidential. Apologies for reading that, but there was just a fair level of density there in terms of where we're sitting right now as a team. Moving forward, what we'll do over the next couple months, firm up external engagement process proposal, integrate the comments from the public notice, as Greg mentioned. We've got those coming in October 30th, so that should give us a good month to get those integrated. The certification sub-working group will have much more time to further vet what the next steps are and finish the key industry group feedback back on areas to reduce regulatory burdens. So with that, that's where we sit right now, and open to comments or questions, feedback from the TAC, people online, et cetera, the FCC.
Questions or comments? Pierre, lead it off.
Thank you, Dennis. Just a question or a comment about, I think it was the middle presentation, which was the conversation about standards versus regulations versus multiple stakeholder organizations. This may be a mental model thing, it may be a language thing, but to me, industry standards, consensus standards happen way after innovation is done. In my mind, the role of regulation is to set the minimum requirements so that innovators can get going. And those requirements may be zero. I would be very concerned if there was a movement that the regulator would wait for standards to mature before it made rules. That would stop innovators doing something. I think the multi-stakeholder is different again, because there the FCC encourages or perhaps just observes a group of people in industry who get together to solve a problem. That may or may not eventually result in a standard. but I think that's a different kind of animal.
Yeah. I would see the purpose of regulation would be to settle things like market imbalances or protect consumers. And where that happens in the process is when the harm starts. So I would probably differ with you just a little bit on when that actually kicks in. But we did talk about this whole idea of just how much the standards industry has been disrupted, like all businesses over the last few years, and how first to market people are setting, in many cases, the de facto standard, even if there isn't a standard, or individual creators are developing open source products that are put out there and become adopted and become standards just by default. And we think all of that has to be relevant to what is being considered here, not just the traditional standards process, not just the traditional industry advocate process. We kept looking for things that would point us in a direction to take interval out of the process. And we're not closed on that. We're still getting input on it. I don't think there's an easy solution because of the rules that the Commission has to work by. Like even in the robocalling one that I mentioned, they've done 2 notices and proposed rulemakings on different aspects of what has been proposed from a technology point of view. So it's going to take several parts of this discussion to really consider the broad implications of it. But anything that sort of leads us down a path where it's more open and maybe faster for the Commission to decide that they need to be involved or not, I think would be helpful. Russ, do you want to add to that? Or
any other questions or comments for the group? Any on the phone? Okay, great.
Yes, could I? Oh. And I promise I'll just say one of my concerns is with the small firms and small public interest groups being able to engage in this sort of stuff early on, because the early choices of architecture, choices of architecture have a big influence on how things come in. And if public interest groups don't have adequate notice about those early changes, it may be impossible to go back and fix problems later on. So I'm sort of a broken record in this area, but I think it really is important to make sure that public interest groups and so forth have a chance to participate. And the trouble is, in your open standard stuff and so forth, that's really hard to do for some of these small public interest groups.
That's a fair comment. There are some public interest groups that are extremely well funded. When we were having the debate on what the technology adoption would be for the STIR part of the robocalling, Consumer Reports actually went down to Dallas to the meeting. They hired trucks to be a mobile billboard and rode up and down the street. And they actually came into the meeting and engaged with Henning and some of the other presentations on that. So but they're the exception, because they do have people and resources to throw at a problem. And I think the process always has to account for that. One of the reasons that the ADIS and the SIP Forum partnership worked is because even though ADIS has a for-fee membership, the SIP Forum allowed free participation, so everybody could get access to that. And you had a lot of people with 5-6 employees who were developing some sort of a dialing service who participated in the process. So it was not just the large 7 or 8 customers or service providers. It was the entire industry that was affected by it.
I just a comment. I agree with your saying. The problem is that robocalling is we all hate it so much. It is really something that everybody has an opinion and wants to get involved in. If you're talking about captioning or something for it may be a different thing. They may not have the money. It's not as sexy a topic as robocalling, and so it's those cases that maybe we need to have a little bit more attention paid to.
Okay, very good. All right, thank you very much. And okay, please.
There is a similar discussion going on the CSMAC, on the NTA side, especially on the 5G subworking group, where people are saying, hey, you need to have more engagement with these standardization bodies. I'm just wondering from some of these comments, to what level, there is a certain amount of difference between NTA engagement to what FCC does, because there are things on the federal side or on the government side that you want to push through. For example, let's say FirstNet related work, or maybe even some other things related to cybersecurity, maybe where there is a little more interest. On the industry side, I'm trying to look at, is this something you're trying to propose in form of engagement, the WIN forum, for the 3.5 kind of engagement? Or are you thinking something more generic? And is there any guidance that you might want to put as to how much should be the involvement?
So I think, we're not trying to form like a regular ongoing body here. It's sort of an organic engagement process that should start. We're basically putting in place some rules of engagement or a process so that there is fair representation, so that there is, a process for when you would do this from an FCC perspective. But, open to inputs if you want to join one of the team meetings and kick in some of those ideas. But, I think we've got a fairly broad approach in terms of how this would be set up, but it's really driven by need, not, one of the things we did early on, asked the FCC, was to at least put out sort of a technology roadmap, and one of the comments was, well, we can be wrong a lot of times. And that's fine, but I think part of that also guides what organizations focus on. And the FCC really, in my view, wants industry-driven solutions. So it's not like they're trying to meddle or get involved or be a burden. It's more of, I think there's a communication gap sometimes.
Right. Okay, let's move on to the mobile device theft prevention, our long-term effort. And carry forth, Brian, and good to have you back, Rab.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Chairman. We'll give an overview of what we've done in the past several months on mobile device theft prevention. Move to the next slide. This slide is just a reminder of our charter for this year, is to continue building upon the solutions that we've and recommendations that we have put in place over the past several years. And as Walter mentioned earlier, one of those is the engagement with law enforcement and finding out how these solutions that have been put in place already are having an effect on mobile device theft. But also to take a look at the future and see what mobile threats might be evolving and what other recommendations can be put into place to combat theft. Our working group participants, we have a well-represented list here from various sectors of the stakeholders that are engaged in it. Again, I'd like to put a thank you out to all the members and companies that have representation on the committee and are providing input. Without your input, we certainly couldn't move this along as much as we have been. So one of the focus areas this year has been to investigate possible methods to obtain regular updates. As Walter had mentioned earlier, this has been an ongoing recommendation for a couple of years now within the mobile device theft working group. And we really need to continue to get that statistics refresh from law enforcement to see how big of an impact we're having, and to make sure the solutions that we're putting into place are having the right, seeing the right trends on a decrease in mobile device thefts. But also from that, we also need to get more operators engaged, not only internationally, but also here domestically. And I'll go into this a little bit more later, but we've got some work to do here in the U.S. And a lot of work to do internationally. We would like to take a look at what 5G might have to offer in terms of additional solutions, and there is some work going on within some of the industry bodies right now, such as hardening of the IMEI and looking at that. And also future enhancements to the stolen phone checker, which was launched, and see what additional enhancements we can put into place in order to better support the needs of those users of that. So when we look at statistics, we do have a very limited set of data that we did obtain. And what we found from 2013 to 2016, there's a promising 50% decline. Now, before we get too excited to that, I want to reemphasize that this is just based on some limited statistics that we had obtained, and we do need additional cities to give us some more data so that we can say that this is really a good thing and it's promising nationwide. There are many efforts underway, including outreach, word of mouth, the IMEI stolen phone list that may be contributing to this decline. What we don't know is which specific programs are having the biggest impact and which may not have a limited impact or not. But altogether, from one major city, we're seeing promising data being returned. The GSM Association is also involved in a number of initiatives. The first is trying to figure out where these stolen devices are going. And I know, Dennis, this has been a question for us for a couple of years now. And the biggest challenge is really the GSM Association or any individual operator doesn't really have any visibility on what devices connect to individual mobile networks. However, given that challenge, there are potential ways to come up with solutions. One option is to get network operators that are connected to the IMEI database to report on instances when they notice connection attempts by IMEIs that are contained within the database. So that's one thing that may be a way to try to glean some data on where devices are ending up. The second is to go into the GSM Association's device check service, which is basically what the CTIA portal is built on, and try to look at instances where the IMEI that's blacklisted, for example, here in the U.S., if somebody in, pick your favorite country, India, is doing a check on that IMEI, there would be reason to suspect that device may have shipped over to India if somebody's checking that IMEI in India. So there's a couple of different options that are being investigated here to try to figure out where these stolen devices are ending up. We're going to continue to explore these with the GSM Association and see which of these, if not both of these, may make sense. The second is connecting more operators in other countries to the IMEI database. If you recall, on the last presentation I gave at the last meeting, I showed a map of the world, and there was a lot of regions in the world that are not covered under the IMEI database. They're not reporting or checking on devices that are stolen. The fundamental goal is to get more operators in other countries to connect to this database, so that takes the value of those devices, down to zero to ship over to those countries. This is a fundamental desire of the GSM Association, is to get as many countries and operators connected as possible. But again, it's a very difficult undertaking due to many reasons, including financial, benefits to the operators in those countries, as well as, the politics of some of the countries. The GSM Association is going to put focus on countries or regions where regulatory attention is high at the present. And one of those regions happens to be Africa right now. A lot of the countries in Africa are putting a lot of regulatory pressure on stolen devices. So the GSM Association is working with those countries and those regulators in those countries to try to see if we can get more operators from the African continent to connect to the database. But there's still much more work to be done, as I mentioned, not only overseas, but here in the U.S. Currently, there's just 5 operators out of approximately 50 GSMA member networks connected to the global database. So we have more work to do to increase those statistics as well. The other is IMEI security hardening. Last year, the GSM Association did a review and updated the IMEI security technical design principles and the IMEI security weakness reporting and correction process. The good news is they haven't received a single report of a compromised IMEI implementation from the U.S. So it's really not clear how much of an issue this might be for us here in the U.S. One of the next activities is to review and increase device and chip manufacturer participation in the IMEI security initiatives in order to reflect the current device market, and also to restore a service that the GSM Association had in place several years back to monitor and report on device models that have had their IMEI implementations compromised. This way they can keep track and publicize which devices may be subject to IMEI tampering. On the GSMA international engagement, this has been an area that the GSMA has highlighted as an area where the FCC might be able to help, although at present we haven't come up with a specific recommendation or idea on how we could possibly engage the FCC and the GSMA in helping international operators get on board. Some regions for local regulators, they tend to develop their own systems to share stolen data, and they ignore the global solutions that have been developed. And this creates undesirable fragmentation and unnecessary duplication of effort and cost for all stakeholders. So one of the recommendations we're looking at for the end of the year is to try to identify how the FCC can help with and determine what options and avenues are available to complement what GSMA is doing on the international scene. Moving to the next topic, the CTIA also had contracted Harris to do a survey on mobile users and cybersecurity, looking at the attitudes and behaviors. And this is a repeat of surveys that were conducted in 2012, 2015, 2016, and now 2017. The first item to note, out of this survey is the trend in behaviors of consumers and the noted improvement over time. We see that smartphone users have increased the use of PINs or passwords on their devices, update their software almost every time, and has antivirus software pre-installed. And we've seen an increase in the number of users over the past 3 years use these security mechanisms. As far as the remote lock software, we've seen about half the users have used this, and that trend has stayed flat over the past couple of years. Looking into this a little bit more, about half of the smartphone users have the remote lock and locate, but over 1/3 of the owners did not know if they have this feature or not on their devices, and 14% had the feature but didn't enable it. If you look at this chart, this gives a breakdown in current smartphone users' ability to enable the feature or not. And it just supports the fact that 51% have the feature enabled and about 50% do not. If we look over the past 2 years, almost 2/3 of the users enabled the remote unlock capability within that period. So of that 51%, it was over the last 2 years that they enabled this. And one thing that's important to note here is 57% had received their smartphone that had that capability already on the smartphone. So that's supporting the industry commitment to have those capabilities on the devices when they purchase them. And as you see, some of the other reasons why users enabled it include someone encouraged them to use the capability. It was automatically enabled. They lost or had a smartphone stolen, and they had it set it up to protect a family member's device. When we look at devices that are lost versus stolen, we find that lost devices are much more likely misplaced than versus stolen. And if we look at the trend over the past 3 years, you'll see that huge majority of the respondents to the survey didn't lose or have a device stolen over the past couple of years. Although in 2017, you'll see a slight uptick, 13% versus 11 and 12% in the prior years over lost or stolen devices, although most of those devices were likely misplaced. And those who lost a smartphone are more likely to contact their service providers as one of the first steps after losing their device. And as you see here, for the smartphones, 55% of the respondents are most likely to contact their service provider first to suspend their device's service, followed by calling the device to listen for it or using a remote program to locate the device, all above 50%. You'll notice down below, 28%, one of their behaviors is to contact the local police, whereas 37% would be to contact their insurance carrier. It's also important to note that almost half of the stolen smartphones were recovered. And this, of the 13% lost or stolen phones, 9% were lost, 4% were stolen, and almost, 55% of those stolen devices were not recovered, whereas 45% were recovered. And likewise with misplaced phones, the vast majority, 68%, were recovered, whereas 32% were not. Some of the individual actions or behaviors when the phone is missing is similar, since most consumers assume that a phone is lost rather than jump to the conclusion immediately that it was stolen. So one of the first actions, again, search house, car, yard, try to locate it there. The second is to attempt to call the phone to see if they can hear the ringtone. Try to retrace the steps and or reach for places where they've been recently. Try to track the phone using locator service or onboard tracking software. And then finally contact the service provider to help locate the device and suspend service. So these behaviors, there's not much difference between the behavior of a consumer who loses a phone versus a consumer who has a phone stolen. They take the similar actions and try to locate the device and ultimately call the service provider to suspend service. So some of the takeaways on this particular study, if in deciding whether a device is lost or stolen, a lot of that depends upon the location. The consumer will consider where the phone went missing, if it was at home or lost in a public location, and then they'll decide whether it was lost or stolen. They'll use phone tracker software in order to try to locate where the where the phone has been, or shows its movement since it was misplaced. And they'll also look at phone logs to see what activity the phone had on it after it went missing. Whether to remote wipe the device or not depends upon where the location of the device is and whether or not they actually think the phone is gone into somebody else's hands. There's a reluctance to use the wipe feature if the phone is lost and there's a high chance of recovering that device. So the consumers typically tend to be a little conservative in their actual use of those type of features. The biggest roadblocks seem to be not knowing about what features are available on their devices or not knowing how to use it or enable it. And two of the respondents had concerns about data being accidentally wiped once enabled. So one of the things we need to consider as we move into the recommendation phase is how to make consumers aware of these features, including setup wizards, making it part of device setup, and the role of the store techs to inform the consumers. So the next steps, we're going to continue to analyze future threats and consequences of mobile phone theft solutions. We are going to determine the impact of the stolen phone checker and provide any suggested improvements to the CTIA for consideration. Determine if mobile device theft prevention activity effectiveness, especially as related to stolen phones, international destinations. We want to continue working on establishing those communication channels with law enforcement. We do have a limited data from San Francisco. We want to try to increase the number of cities where we get the data from and determine if the trends are going to hold nationwide. And finally, we need to finalize recommendations around the CTIA surveys and GSM Association initiatives, and also work with the GSM Association to develop a plan to bring its best practices implementation to fruition in order to have a consistency of approach and policy to device blocking and data sharing. So that concludes the presentation, Mr. Chairman.
Very good. It's been a lot of work over a lot of years in this. We still have some nagging problems, which is disconcerting, and you've highlighted those in the talk. But it remains a very, very important issue. Hopefully, as we secure information from other cities, the trends that you've highlighted in the single city will be borne out in others. That will be a key point just from a data gathering standpoint. But there are so many of these things. One of my bugaboos, where are these phones going? It remains a mystery to us, and getting the international engagement to the level that we'd like to see it is a related concern. Any other comments or questions from the group? Russ, please.
Just a quick one. In light of a recent telephone announcement and the cost of that phone, do you see any collaboration between that company that produced that phone, or any concerns about increasing theft on something that goes by 10 or X?
Well, certainly we'll have to watch the trends as new devices come out, with new price points on devices and new capabilities. It makes it more attractive to some people. So we'll have to watch those trends carefully. Certainly, one would hope new devices that come out have the latest and greatest initiatives and software installed that will help with the mobile device theft prevention. But over time, we'll see.
One of the things I haven't paid as much attention perhaps as others on this announcement, but one of the things that could help is just the literal announcement by the company of the fact that these are very secure phones, and don't mess with these phones because you won't derive any value.
Right.
Because some of the thieves are really not so knowledgeable. They see a bright shiny device and they grab it, even if they can't do anything with it. But making it better known is another component of this.
Sure.
Good. Mark.
Yeah, you're talking about you're working with international stuff. I was reading up on the UK, and they've had such a dramatic increase in their phone thefts over the last, say, 6 months to a year. And they're up to, in the UK, and the statistics, I sent you some over, up to 10,000 phones stolen per month in just London. and that's a phenomenal amount of phones.
Yeah.
And they've implemented the IMEI database, yet the phone thefts are continuing to increase at a dramatic rate. Do you have any idea have you done any work with the UK guys or anything on this, or the international part?
Not recently. I know the GSM Association has in the past, and we worked with some companies that have worked with operators over in the UK. But I'll take a look at the data you provided, share it with the group, and see if we can get any information.
Yeah, there must be some way they're making money off the phones if they're stealing everybody.
Yeah, no, for sure. Other comments? Oh, there we go. Break.
Brian, this question is kind of strange, but you probably don't have this data, but I'm just curious. When you said people often don't know whether their phones were lost or stolen, are phones ever being stolen in a holdup, or do people actually hold you up for your phone?
Mm-hmm. Yes,
Oh, yeah.
That's what's actually triggered a lot of this work that we're doing.
So then, do you know what percentage that would be?
I'd have to go back and look at some of the statistics we had from the earlier reports, but yeah, it was becoming very visible and a lot of violent crime for phone theft, which was one of the reasons why we instituted some of the initiatives that were put into place over the past couple of years.
One of the reasons DC was an early activist in this area was that they recognized that a large number of DC crimes were phone related, where people were getting hit in the metro or in other areas and the phones taken out, and they saw it as a crime act, not necessarily a theft of property, but a violent crime act. And that was their dominant concern.
And that's continued to be the case, even including the mayor of a city that you know fairly well. His son was held up and phone extracted.
Actually, I did hear that, yes.
Yeah. Yep. Okay, very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Look forward to this next quarter of rigorous activities. Lynn and Mark, you are on.
Great. Thank you very much. Our main goal is to get this meeting back on schedule as much as possible. So we're going to do our share.
Just the guys that can do it.
Well, I hope you also have things to communicate to it as well.
Well, we'll see. The jury's out on that. If we could bring up the slides, though. We'll have to go on to the next generation broadcasting slides. I think we're going
to. You get a credit.
I'm happy to speak to those slides, but you wouldn't want that.
You're up. Slides up, please. Thank you.
There we go. Thank you very much. We're going to talk about the implications of next generation TV broadcast technology. I'm Lynn Claudia, one of the co-chairs. Mark Hess from Comcast to my right. I'll run through the slides, and Mark will intervene and or interject when necessary. This has our participants on the right, FCC liaisons on the left. We're privileged to have FCC liaisons from OET, Strategic Planning Media Bureau, and the Wireless Bureau, so that helps us out a lot. And it's a fairly small group, and even a smaller group that is able to participate in the meetings when we have them, probably because of time of day. So if anyone wants to participate that hasn't been, please let Mark or I know, and we'll be glad to include you in our work. So this is the charter that was set out for us, and the important part of this really is the last sentence there that says the task of the work group is to consider how the new standard might fit into the overall communications landscape of the future. So there is an active proceeding, as some of you or many of you know. we are not participating directly into that proceeding. The charter goes on to say that the intention is specifically not to address the topics raised at that time, the planned rulemaking. Now it's very much underway and perhaps moving towards conclusion this year. But our charter is to facilitate ATSC 3 from the point of view of looking ahead as to how implementation may impact the future of communications generally. So that permeates a lot of our discussions in the group. Just history up to the last TAC meeting. We had some meetings. We had a couple of tutorials on ATSC 3.0 technology itself and on 5G wireless technology. And I've got one slide from each of those presentations in here just to jog your memory and serve as a headline for what those technologies represent. This was from Rich Chernock at Triveni Digital's presentation to us. And the gist of ATSC 3.0 is that it's significantly more than an incremental improvement or even a set of incremental improvements in broadcast technology. Rather, it is somewhat of a step function in all dimensions in terms of physical robustness, in terms of flexibility, shifting to the Internet protocol transport. These are all very fundamental shifts in how broadcasting can and does work. So there's also a vast improvement in compression and a explosion of potential applications, which ultimately means you have a lot of new business models that are possible and perhaps collaborative business models with other wireless services that would make sense now, whereas they've never made sense really before. Then on the 5G side, we had the Ericsson view from Hossam Hamimi, and this shows that basically 5G is expressed in terms of orders of magnitude better or faster in terms of user data rates or latency or the number of connected devices, all with lower cost, with longer battery life, and better coverage. So the point is both broadcast and broadband technology are headed towards an era of significant improvement in the relative near term. So that's where we were at the time of the last TAC meeting in June. We've had a half dozen or so meetings since then, and in that time period had 4 more tutorials and what you might call perspective presentations, as well as a face-to-face meeting this morning here at the FCC. So our presentations were from NBC, from Sinclair Broadcasting, from NAB, and Cable Labs. And I'll show kind of the overall headline of where each of these presentations ended up from their vantage point in the spectrum users world and one of their key point slides. So hopefully that'll start to tell a story that we will finish in the next TAC period and draw conclusions in December. We had Sinclair come in, and Mark Aitken, Director of Advanced Engineering there. He gave the view of that very large television group. Sinclair, if you read the trades at all, is generally a very aggressive and very bullish on the market opportunities of next generation broadcasting. And in particular, they're interesting because they see the delivery of service to mobile devices as a very primary service as opposed to an auxiliary service for broadcasting. And for them, that's the foundation of what they will make their move to ATSC 3.0 about. There are a lot of issues that surround that kind of approach. Delivery to mobile devices means you must have, of course, very robust transmission. That kind of challenges the traditional view of where is the broadcast service contour. It now becomes a moving target instead of a fixed entity. The idea of including different networks within the mobile device world is challenging for those wireless businesses. There are some advocates of that. There are some detractors as well. So in Sinclair's view, you let the marketplace work all that out, and they feel it will work out for everybody, and there'll be a lot of opportunity. We also heard then from Glenn Reitmeyer, VP of Advanced Engineering at NBC Comcast. NBC is also outspoken on the benefits they ascribe to ATSC 3.0. But I'd say that as opposed to Sinclair that has a very targeted view, NBC very attracted to and talks about the multiple features of the technology, and those multiple features being catalysts for new services or making existing services better and more compelling. So I'd put NBC, if one can be forgiven for doing one-word characterizations, put them in the flexibility camp. Then we had So Vang, who is in my department in technology at NAB, but specifically our innovation funding division called Pilot, and he came and talked to us about the develop of a so-called gateway set-top box. This is a box that has both over-the-air reception capability for ATSC 3.0, but it also can integrate with broadband service and Wi-Fi, and is one of the first prototype products that goes beyond POTS, plain old television service of just audio and video, but integrating internet aspects into a combined service, a hybrid service. So this uses broadcast spectrum and it uses Wi-Fi spectrum and whatever is downstream of that for internet connectivity to make a blended, integrated consumer experience. And then lastly, we had Ralph Brown, CTO at Cable Labs, and he talked to us about Wi-Fi networks and what kinds of things slow them down. Cable Labs does a lot of work now in the wireless space. Don't let the name cable fool you. He noted that with Wi-Fi networks, that Wi-Fi is the kind of service, like all internet services really, that depend on statistical multiplexing that allowed multiple users to coexist in the network at more or less the same time. But when you prognosticate a service like ATSC 3.0 and tie the Wi-Fi usage to real-time broadcasting, that kind of upsets some of those statistical assumptions, and in essence it takes something that was asynchronous and only occurred randomly, and it synchronizes everybody together. So your peak needs from Wi-Fi then can pile up and quickly outstrip the supply of data capacity. So he also noted that when you have a lot of Wi-Fi networks close to each other, and there are studies that show how much capacity Wi-Fi has now, but if they're all close to each other in an apartment building, you have interference concerns, and that interference essentially reduces the throughput like it does in Walter's apartment that you can expect, and this is a best effort service, so you have to be careful that you may not get all the things that you thought you might. So here's one slide from the Sinclair presentation, and it shows their view of what they call mobile first and how that philosophy might be realized. And it's a part of the technology that allows this, in that the ATSC 3.0 signal is constructed of a series of signal bootstraps. And these are little signals that come around about every half second or so, and they describe the data that is coming next. So in this example, while most of the time there might be ATSC 3.0 packets of data being sent after the bootstrap, every once in a while you might have a different kind of waveform, one that might be signaled that it was intended only for mobile receivers, and it might not be limited to the mobile transmission modes of ATSC 3.0, but rather targeted to some format of some mobile device that didn't understand ATSC 3.0. So in this way, ATSC 3 has the essential degree of flexibility for integrating with different services and extensibility of an existing service, and they find that very compelling in their business model. This you may have to wait for the offline version of this presentation to read this, but in NBC slides they reminded us basically that there are a wide variety of new tools in ATSC 3.0 that we're not used to seeing in the world of broadcasting, and that those tools can enable some new services that have generally been out of reach previously for broadcasters. So their top list of features includes extensibility, which is similar to the Sinclair example, but other features such as advanced emergency alerting, where receivers can be woken up from a quiescent kind of state, and emergency alerts would no longer be just part of the programming, but could include rich media objects that accompany text messages and maps and so forth. Also, they're intrigued by the opportunities in single-frequency networks, which is, of course, a hallmark of the multiple carrier systems of which ATSC 3.0 is now one, and offers a great deal of increased reliability throughout a service area, or the ability to sculpt a service area or fix gaps in coverage, and that's kind of a new sort of thing. There are also tools that allow the bonding of channels, not new to people in the wireless world, but perhaps very new to broadcasting. So it's an interesting concept of a way to increase spectrum efficiency and share resources. And they of course, also note the importance of IP transport and the use of Internet security standards so that broadcasters can avoid being hacked, and especially for having their content pirated. Then Sovang from NAB showed us how gateway ATSC3 receivers would essentially share Wi-Fi resources within a home network. The receiver is both an over-the-air receiver and a broadband transceiver with Wi-Fi and Internet connectivity. ATSC3 as a concept includes the ability to have blended services between broadcast and broadband, and since it's all Internet protocol delivered data, the interaction and the user interface especially can use all the expertise that we now have out in the world of web developers that have been making these kinds of blended experiences, but only in the Internet world for I don't know, at least the past decade. And that means that seamless integration of service is really a realizable goal, even though we've had the ability to integrate Internet-like things into broadcasting. It really hasn't been a practical kind of proposition. So while this might initially be a set-top box that has this kind of functionality, there's no reason that it wouldn't and couldn't be integrated eventually into the TV set itself, following the same kind of evolution that most new technologies do when they become popular, which is increasing physical device integration. And the TV then becomes not only a TV, but an Internet terminal itself. We have smart TVs now that are also Internet terminals, but the broadcast side and the Internet side, they don't communicate with each other, so it's not what you would consider a truly integrated system. Ralph Brown from Cable Labs also used this same set of slides and talked about the challenges of having the same set of expectations from a reserve bandwidth system like broadcasting or cable with a best efforts network that typically makes up what we know of as the Internet. So if you have a reserve bandwidth system, cable, satellite, broadcasting, you know exactly how much capacity is available at all times, and you use it and manage it at your risk and at your peril. With the Internet, though, you never really know, because demand and supply can vary continuously, and especially when demand goes up, it can exceed supply, and then something else has to happen to mitigate the demand or arbitrate among competing requests for priority or service. So Ralph was basically in the camp of when you blend these kinds of different systems together, first of all, expect the unexpected and plan for it. And if that's where you have aspirations to combine broadcast and broadband, be careful. So here are the specific questions that are raised in the charter for this working group. What we're doing is in getting smart about the baseline technologies, and then we're attempting to answer the questions or find out which ones of these might be problematic and where the most pernicious issues are, or where missing questions are that aren't on this list but kind of flow out of the work we do as we dive down into the technologies. So far, I would say we have not found areas of tremendous concern where the marketplace itself won't be effective to work things out, or where it's just clear as a bell that intervention from the FCC is going to be needed. It is certainly premature to make any conclusions about that, though, even though that might be, and maybe that's even my personal analysis, not borne out by any consensus within the group. But it is premature to form conclusions. We're going to be focusing our attention on this in the remaining period of our TAC work this fall. So what's next is our next immediate step. We have one more, perhaps the last presentation, from a mobile network operator on the topics that are germane to this working group, and that will be TAC member Brian Daly has volunteered to provide the AT&T perspective. So that's coming up for us in the next few weeks. And then beyond that, we're going to dive in on the charter questions and other issues that have come up in the tutorial presentations and our own discussions. So our goal is to tie that all up in an appropriate final form that we have not decided upon yet, and submit recommendations to TAC at the December 6th meeting. That is the entirety of our presentation. So please ask Mark any questions.
Yeah, I get just a couple other thoughts on it, because it's been really great learning more and more about ATSC 3.0. It is kind of the Swiss Army knife of broadcasting technology. And that is, to a certain extent, some of the issues we're facing is that, it is so flexible and even so complex that you're not exactly sure how it might be deployed. As you can see, Sinclair has one view of the world, NBC's is totally different, so that's good. I think we did identify that in the home, their care needs to be taken. Wi-Fi is, somewhat finite. We talked about one potential implementation where that receiver might have a Wi-Fi capability of its own, which would be really problematic. We don't think that's going to happen, so there's a lot of what I'll call, and Lynn and I talked about this, kind of flashing yellows out there, because we don't know what we don't know in some sense. So that's, I'm kind of inclined to be where Lynn is. We haven't stumbled upon anything that's going to cause, we don't see any huge issues, but we're still digging around. We've got to hear about 5G, which is the Swiss Army knife of wireless technology. So we'll see how those two play together. The only other thing I would say that on the NBC side of things, that flexibility around spectrum, the ability to bond channels, might be an opportunity in the future as we look at how the FCC kind of manages and helps us manage the finite over-the-air spectrum as it is. So once again, until it's deployed and you see it how it kind of happens, you're not really sure what that'll look like. We just in the meeting today talked about single frequency and the extension of that and what that might do to other markets. So we just got to play this out a little bit. But we've learned a lot, and I think, like I said, not anything that I can see problematic. A couple flashing yellows, we'll try to point those out in the report, and we'll go from there.
Great. I think David is the first one up with questions. You're on.
I'm curious if you've been able to assess the, say, financial level of investment that stations and others would have to make, and where, as a consequence of the technology. So it's not per se a technical question, but it's driven by the technology. And where I'm really going with that is not the exact number, but is the level at a scale where it's likely to lead to people withdrawing from the market or to further consolidation in the industry. And then at the other end of the spectrum, it's the revenue opportunity such that it could, cause pressure of new entrants or, some of the kind of residual folks that have, say, public licenses to want to, up their game.
I can't say we've gone headlong into that discussion. I think the atmospherics around how this technology will be rolled out are conducive to keeping people in the market. In other words, the price of entry is relatively low to do fairly mundane things or things that are similar to what you do now, but are compelling in one aspect or another. And then you can add new capabilities or add single frequency networks. Some of the things that start to incur a lot of capital cost as time and finances allow. So if there is a tendency for people to for further consolidation or to get out of the market, I think those are kind of long term as we find out. First of all, since it's an entirely voluntary-led transition, is it going to be popular, and is it the kind of thing where if you want to stay in business, you better be doing this because everyone else is, and now no one's watching you since you're not, and then those big decisions have to be made. But initially, it's going to be a mixed market in terms of the old service will coexist with the new service, and those that don't have the immediate capabilities to move forward won't have to. So hopefully that will mitigate some of the the filtering of only the rich will survive. But we'll see. It's a good question, and it is not something that we have really discussed within the working group.
Greg, you were next.
Lynn, are there any regulations in Part 76 that are holding back implementation of ATS-3?
In the cable or 773 is television. The existing proceeding on ATSC3 is pretty much a comprehensive soup to nuts. It's everything that broadcasters would need to be regulated by. It covers how cable carriage or MVPD carriage in general would be. There are a lot of different views on that have been expressed in the proceeding. Reply comments are all done now. So I don't think that anything outside that proceeding is necessary to go forward. Maybe downstream when you start looking at some of these interactions between services, years down the road, unintended consequences of adjacent services or combinations of services or market power and things that government might care about could be under study. But it's I think everything that the FCC needs to care about to at least authorize the service is in the existing proceeding. So our work is more around the edges of that to say, assume that the service is authorized. How does it fit within the greater communications set of services?
Thanks.
Mark?
Sure, okay. My question relates upon, you were saying that OTA providers are combining the over-the-air broadcast with the internet broadcast, that there's no real synergy there, where there's no real central guide to jump from the internet to the OTA channel. I was wondering, has there been any thought about the OTA channels? Because people would have their digital antenna in their house. they could pick up, say, 10 of the 15 channels or 30 of the channels, but in different locations, they wouldn't be, some people would pick up one channels, but they'd still be in that broadcast area. Is there any thought of automatically, when they do their channel scan, to pick up on which channels they can pick up over the air, and then be able to stream them the channels that they should be able to see over the OTA if they weren't able to pick up with the antenna? And you could then send those channels over the internet to them?
Well, there's a lot of wild goings on with over the top versus over the air, and devices that can do both, and how do you best make use of those things. I don't know. Brian Markwalder may have some view on.
Yeah. If you think about it, if you're in the D.C. metropolitan area and you look online at the FCC database and you look at what channels should be within your metropolitan area, and you put up your digital antenna and you can pick up 60% of them, but you can't pick up the others. I know that the local OTAs, there's limitations of them streaming outside of their metropolitan broadcast area.
Right.
But if they only stream to the customers that were inside the metropolitan broadcast area that they would be receiving, and that would mean people with OTA devices would then be able to pick up all the channels that they were supposed to be able to pick up on. And it wouldn't violate into the current FCC rules of broadcasting outside of the metropolitan broadcast areas. But it would give them full utilization of what OTA channels they should be able to pick up.
Yeah, I think that's within bounds for not only broadcasters contract for geographic exclusivity of programming with their network providers. For instance, it's not really an FCC rule, but within not wanting to put that out for indiscriminate redistribution on the global internet, and being able to filter that to the proper geography, those kinds of configurations are certainly possible. I think it's within the marketplace to decide, would people buy something like that? Would they, and under what conditions would that be attractive to them?
Yeah, it should be easy enough to do, because you do the channel scan, you pick up on the channels from those areas, so you'd know what location they were in, and so you'd be able to make sure that they get the right, which ones they'd be able to get, because you'd be able to compare that to the channels that they could pick up over the OTA, and then that would give you their what channel, what area they'd be in. So it'd be should work. I think it'd be a great service if it isn't incorporated already into what people are looking at and the standards of it.
Can I just add a comment?
Yeah.
I mean, I think this is one of Mark's flashing yellow lights.
Okay.
The boundaries of the DMAs, right? Whether the stations are going to be able to stay effectively within their traditional boundaries. Yeah. Whether that's through a single frequency network that's broadcasting the signal more robustly than it ever has been before, or this idea that you go over the top with your broadcast signal and somehow you geofence that internet distribution. Sounds good.
We do a hybrid, so that way people can pick it up OTA. They're not utilizing phenomenal amounts of bandwidth to pull it over the top, and then that way it balances out that need for where people can get the OTA channels without having to, the providers of the OTA channels, having to stream all the content out to every provider, every group. So that way the box would only send them what channels they couldn't pick up over the OTA.
I'm guessing that the broadcasters are hoping that the new configuration of ATSC 3.0 is so robust that issue of not being able to get the signals is not going to be one.
Well, that would be good.
But interestingly enough, it's certainly a way it could happen.
All right.
Okay, Kerry, and then Walter, and then we'll need to move on. But Kerry, go ahead.
Okay, always great to see technologies evolve further for the benefit of the consumer, and ATSC 3 seems to be a good example of a giant leap in that regard. But it's also important to understand impacts to other technologies, and mobile devices were mentioned as a possible recipient of ATSC 3 signal. But it also seems that it's an area where that impact is evident, and that's because devices are not designed with broadcast frequencies in mind. So the issue is more complex than just adding a chip that supports ATSC 3.0. It will impact the RF front end and the antenna design of the devices, which is particularly challenging in the US, where we already operate on low frequencies like 600 and 700. So it's a matter of cost, and it's a matter of possible performance impacts, maybe even interference between these different systems. So the question that I have is the working group maybe planning on looking into that aspect and understanding what that could entail, so that proper recommendations can be given to FCC on that regard.
Yeah, well, we were talking about that this morning, actually, and of course there have been a number of communications within the ATSC3 proceeding on how suitable the broadcast frequencies are, or how similar or dissimilar are they for integration within a mobile device. I mean, we kind of think that's a marketplace concern, and we were noting this morning that it's interesting that other countries, in particular Japan and Korea, both in the case of Japan, they have the existing mobile service that operates in the broadcast band, and in Korea they're planning to migrate their VHF mobile video service to the ATSC 3.0 service. So we thought we might learn something from how those countries are either succeeding or running into obstacles on using broadcast frequencies and especially the antenna problems that might accrue in trying to achieve reception in devices of that small dimension. So we can look at it a little bit, but we're not, we're not device designers. So,
Walter, final word.
We've sort of established that we know what we don't know at this point, and you're about to launch off on a series of experimentations that will help to define what the capabilities are and maybe future requirements. Do you have any expectation and timings in terms of when you would have an understanding as an industry in terms of what capabilities or requirements are needed to underlie ATSC3 in terms of a service platform? We talked about some of the issues and the imponderables. You're going to start a number of experiments, hopefully shortly, in terms of starting to go forward in this area. Have you looked at reasonable timelines when you're going to establish some of the basic principles that you hope to define and needed issues in terms of either regulation or cooperation with other industry groups?
Well, I think it's uncharted territory, and there are the truly converted, and then there are those that aren't so sure. So there will be experimentation, and for some it will be at a furious pace, and for others it will be sit back and monitor how the pioneers are doing. So I don't have real insight on how it's going to go, because I think it has. ATSC3 for the broadcast industry is literally a leap before you look kind of timeline that to understand the answers to the questions when you don't even know the questions, we need to get started. And so the sooner that there's the authorizations are done and equipment is available and money is allocated, that will kind of determine who is really going to be aggressive in the marketplace. And it may be a lot of the industry, but it probably won't be 100% of the industry. So that's a long way of qualifying an I don't know answer.
Very nicely done.
Well, let's move on. You have failed in your objective of catching us back up, but I think you've succeeded very well in providing a lot of illuminating information. So
apologies to the chair and the group.
No, you only set expectations. Steve, you're on.
Great.
Well, take us out of this world.
Okay, can you please bring up the slides?
As soon as Walter gets them moved over. Okay, take it away.
You're up and running.
Okay. So the working group has been fairly stable in its TAC membership, and it has been expanding in its list of contributors. We're very fortunate that we have a fairly active group of contributors. This is our plan charter. There's no change here, so no reason to dwell on it. But the restatement and how we're thinking about it is worth talking about. Really, if you can kind of boil this down to, this is about scaling. This is about what happens as you get more satellites, and you can think of that as a model of like even around something like a Nextel, where they acquired some spectrum and started to use that spectrum, and there was a demand driver for the use of that spectrum. As that spectrum got used in new ways, it led to interference that was probably there all along, but was de minimis and therefore sort of unnoticeable. That kind of encapsulates what we think we're doing. So that leads to the two main activities. One, our risk-based interference, our white paper and study, and two, the drivers of demand that we think are going to likely be driving some of that interference. So we have been fortunate to have many presentations, and I'm not going to summarize all of them. Instead, I'm going to just concentrate on a few. We were really quite taken with Joe Fregola, suggested by Adam Drobot, and he truly is a world-class expert in this field. The main takeaways are that it's a huge undertaking to bring together experts, and it must be a wide range of them from different companies. You can't just go get one smart guy from one company and get there. And to look at historical data, to look at current data, and to figure out ways to share data. And then to go from there, the thing that sort of struck me that I really liked was you need to carve nature at its joints. You need to use expert opinion to figure out what the high-level estimates are, so when you go do those detailed risk-based assessments, you can spot your mistakes. And you can see that where you're wrong and go back and fix them. So, basic guidelines, I have them listed out. I don't need to say each one, but it's using all of the data is really important, and always testing your preconceived notions. You think you know it, you start with an assumption of there's a risk of this, maybe there's not. Maybe that's where you're making your mistake in your analysis, right there. So always be going back and looking at that. And the notion of forming a multi-stakeholder body with third-party data, he hit on that in multiple ways, in multiple examples of that being the way to go. And so that is the potential basis of a recommendation. And leading into that, that kind of leads us into AGI, which they are a company which has built up a very nice code base that's useful for satellites, both to avoid collisions, but also to tell you what's going on with interference, both from people who are participating and people who are not participating in the consortium. They've been slowly building up their satellite providers. Can't say they even have a plurality at this point, but they are making progress. And so a potential thing that we might recommend would be, how might the FCC nudge things to move in that direction? And we need to come up with something more concrete before that represents a recommendation. We also had Jennifer Manor make a presentation, and she talked about the activities in 3GPP and how important it is to include satellite as part of the 5G world, and that failure to do so really is going to leave many use cases unaddressed, and it's just not going to be as good a world. There have been some challenges, but also very hopeful and positive in terms of the progress, and is, I think, working that even now. So this is the list of our presentations that we've received, and then you can see that we have planned presentations, and anybody who is interested in being invited to these things, please let me know. Also, we will be having presentations on the white papers themselves and reviews of those. So at this point, turn it over to Pierre. Here's the clicker.
Right. Thank you very much, Steve. So what I'd like to do, once I have some audio, and eventually I will have some audio, but I'll just keep.
There you go.
There we go. All right. So let me just say a little bit about the subgroup that's working on risk assessment. The list of the people were at the front of the deck. Essentially, what we're seeing risk assessment here as helping us with is to prioritize where one pays attention to the design of a system. So you say, well, what's the system? What's the problem? The problem we are looking at here is the coexistence of multiple large non-geostationary satellite constellations. So when we started at the beginning of this process, our scope was both geostationary satellite and non-geostationary satellite. We focused that down to just the non-geo to non-geo coexistence. I'll show you a couple more pictures in a few slides so you can get a sense of what we're talking about. To the extent that we need to think about particular bands, we're going to focus on the V band, which is 40 to 50. There are also large constellations of this type in the Ku and Ka band, in other words, 10 to 30 gigahertz odd. But in the V band, these non-geostationary satellites, none of them are flying yet. 9 networks have applied for authorization for V-band in the United States, applying to the FCC. The constellation sizes vary wildly, from 3 to more than 7,000. The altitudes at which these things fly vary wildly, from 350 kilometers to 8,000 kilometers in the V-band. And so the challenge is, if you have these multiple systems orbiting and at those kinds of altitudes with the large constellations, at any given time you may have 3, 4, or 5 visible, but they come and go every 10 minutes. How do you avoid interference between these different systems? So the approach that we're using here is risk assessment, which is something that the TAC knows well by now. There are 4 steps that we're going to use. In fact, we're just going to focus on the first 2 steps. So the first 2 steps are figuring out what the hazards are and what the mitigations are. Step 2 is figuring out what bad is. In other words, what's the consequence metric. Steps 3 and 4 are actually doing the calculations. We won't be doing that, but hopefully we can establish a framework that parties and the FCC can use to estimate what the risks of these things are. So let me just start with the first step, hazards and mitigations. They come in 2 flavors, basically. The baseline hazards are the things that will hit you in the head even when you don't have to worry about interference. And if you're a wireless system, the 2 kinds of things there are, one is your desired signal may fade, regardless of whether there's interference. In the V-band, for example, there's a lot of problem with attenuation from rain and cloud and so on. Different places in the country have more or less attenuation. And of course, there's always faults and failures, misconfigurations, human error, hardware faults, all sorts of things like that. Now, once you have those things as your baseline, you think about the coexistence hazards. I'll give you examples in a couple of slides of both co-channel and adjacent channel interference. But one of the things that we learned from Dr. Fragolo was, figure out what the dominant failure modes are. And so this is our first cut If you imagine these constellations, you've got things up in space, you've got things on Earth. They're talking to each other, downlink from space to Earth, uplink from Earth to space. Because these things are frequency division duplex, the downlink and the uplink are different frequencies, we don't expect that Earth stations will interfere with Earth stations or space stations with space stations, so that's negligible. And so we'll focus on the elements on the diagonal in this little matrix. And what the risk assessment will actually help you to do is to compare what different mitigation solutions will get you. So for example, if you just simply think about what are 3 options you might compare if you have a potential interference event between 2 constellations. The first is you do nothing, and it may be that the risk to your service is relatively low. The second thing is if you have an allocation and there's potential interference, you split the band. Let's say there are 2 systems, one takes the lower half, the other one takes the upper half. And then the third possibility is you actually do clever things with pointing the beams of these different systems to avoid interference, in which case both systems get to use the whole bandwidth. So those are the kinds of things that a risk assessment can help you to compare. And to make that a little bit more concrete, I want to show you a couple of drawings. So here we're going to look at the canonical way of thinking of interference with these kinds of systems, known as an inline event. And so imagine we've got 2 networks, the blue one A and the pink one A and the blue one B. And if system B's space station is in line between A's space station and A's Earth station, that's called an inline event. And you can see that if B is transmitting essentially collinear to A, this is on the downlink, you could get interference. What the rules say today is if the parties can't figure out a way to solve that, and I'll show you a few ways they could solve it in the next slide, but if they can't solve it, then they split the band. And so that's what we show in that little diagram to the right on the first part of the slide. I'm plotting frequency from left to right, so you can see that red system takes the lower half of the allocated band, blue system takes the upper half. And on the y-axis, I'm plotting the PFD, the power flux density, which is just a fancy way of saying the signal strength. Now, there are a couple of things to think about. Even though you've split the band, it doesn't necessarily mean you don't have interference. So what I show there is leakage from A into B. You could also have B's receiver cell activity couldn't be sufficient, so that B is actually seeing some of the energy in the pink side of the band. Now, in this particular case, it turns out there probably isn't going to be interference because the signal strengths are the same, and that's in fact an exponential scale on the left, so there isn't an interference problem in this case. However, there may be in the case on the right. So here I'm turning the signals around, so I'm doing an uplink. And imagine that system A spacecraft is a long way away. It's further away than B. So to get to A, the transmitter on the ground is putting out a lot more power in the red channel than in the blue channel. And if you actually look at the signal strength at B, in other words, the lower one of those 2 charts, you'll see that the pink signal is quite strong. And you can see there's a possibility of leakage, and there's a possibility of receiver selectivity problems. You don't have the problem up at A because B signal is so weak. So the takeaway from this is that if you don't coordinate, you have to split the band. That gives people an incentive to coordinate. So how would they coordinate? That's what takes us to the next slide. So here are 2 ways you could coordinate. One, on the left, we talk about satellite diversity. So if both constellations have multiple satellites that you can see at the same time, remember I was saying that there might be 4 of them visible at the same time. Rather than transmitting from A1 and B1, you transmit from A2 and B2. The beams are narrow enough and the receivers are selective enough in their antenna patterns that there is no interference, and both networks get to use the whole band. Alternatively, if you look on the right, B is in line with A, but when it transmits, it points away from A's receiver. There's not going to be interference at A, and again, they coordinate. They don't have to worry about interference. So those are the kinds of situations that we'll look at when we look at the different hazards that need to be dealt with. So on this slide, you can read faster than I can talk, so I'm not going to talk through all of this. But just to point out, these are some of the things that I've discussed with these graphic slides. Remember I said that you may have an inline event. Now, many times there are lots of satellites that may be in line, but they may be off, in which case you don't have a problem because the satellite isn't transmitting. Second, to resolve the coordination problems, you can use the satellite diversity or the geodiversity. Third, I mentioned the possibility of cross-channel interference. So that's a risk. There are ways to resolve that using power control in the uplink. You could also improve the selectivity of your receivers and the adjacent channel leakage of your transmitters. And in fact, in the end, if you are going to get interference, you can use adaptive coding and modulation to reduce that risk as well. So those are all ingredients that go into the soup. When you bake the soup or make the soup, you taste the soup and you use the consequence metric to tell you how nice it tastes. There are lots of consequence metrics, possible ones. We are still discussing all the permutations. I'm not going to rehearse them for you here. Suffice it to say that probably one of the likely metrics that we'll use is the percentage degradation of throughput. On one of the earlier slides, if you go back, you'll see that there was one of the presentations we had from Daryl Hunter. ITU Working Party 4B has recommended using this metric for protection criteria for geostationary satellites, and it seems as if it might work for non-geos as well. But discussion is ongoing. Last but not least, to put just a little bit more flesh on the bone on the multi-stakeholder body. So remember, you've got these systems. If there's only one system, you don't have a problem. If there are just two systems, they're likely they can go behind closed doors, they can figure it out. But remember that in the V band, there are 9 applicants. In the KUKA band, there are 12. So probably there's going to be a number greater than 1, but fewer than 9 of these systems that have to coordinate. And figuring out the rules is probably not something that the FCC is well suited to do, which has led us to think about multiple stakeholder bodies, multiple stakeholder processes. So some of the things that a multi-stakeholder group can do, the first is it can figure out the protocols for communicating data between these parties to figure out when there might be an interference event. If parties are nervous about sharing information with each other, it could act as a trusted third party. And in fact, in the end, it may or may not act as, in fact, the resolver of potential interference events. We are looking for groups that might teach us something about how to do this. There are other groups with similar goals, if not tackling this problem. So, for example, there are a number of coordination groups in the ITU that look at these kinds of issues. Steve mentioned the Space Data Association. They are actually tracking objects in orbit. So this is physical collision, not RF collision, but there may well be something we can learn there. And there are, of course, also professional bodies that we've listed there that could help us learn about how to do this. Potential TAC work for the next 3 months. We will think about this. We may make recommendations about what works in frequency coordination, because the FCC has had a lot of experience with this. And when it comes to setting up multiple stakeholder bodies, again, ditto. The TAC was involved in recommendations, for example, for 3.5. The FCC played a big role in encouraging that. So what factors would justify that kind of activity? And if there were to be a multiple stakeholder body for this non-geo coordination, what might the scope of a group like that be? What might the deliverables of a group like that be? So that's an update on the subgroup, and let me hand back to Steve to close out.
Thank you, Pierre. Okay, is this working? So the second thing that we're looking at is drivers of demand. And so I want to open with just a little bit of data. So this is FCC data, 477 reports. And what you see here is you know that over time, the capabilities of systems have been going up. And you can see that, so you can kind of imagine that just in the different categories that are here. Then what each of those bars are within each of those categories is representing if there's 0 providers, and that's the bottom, very small gray stuff. That's small on the left and rather large on the right. But you also see that that's going down over time, even with the 50 plus megabit per second service. But the second point is, what's the gray is 1 provider, and the blue above it is 2 providers. So for a lot of those services, it's 1 or 2. That's it. That's the choice that is available at most households. And 3 or more, that's the top gray. And so you can see that for the highest end services, there aren't 3 or more providers for most of those. It doesn't exist. Now this is as of 2016. FCC has yet to publish 477 data that's more recent, even though I know it's been sent in.
How is it that you would know that?
We sent it in.
Yes, I know.
So what you see here is that there's opportunity, there's demand, just for flat out plain internet service. And so that demand itself is driving entrance in the satellite space. And there's others. I mean, 5G is looking at that and eyeing it too. And I'm not quite sure if the TV guys are eyeing it or not at this point, but maybe they are. And then now I want to introduce a different notion. This is all talking about universal service. A lot of the new applications around IoT are more around what I would call ubiquitous service. Not just where people live, but where people are. And where devices are, which can be all over the place. So if you start thinking in terms of the cost of ubiquity, this is the tip of the iceberg. This is just where people live. What happens when you start looking at the cost of ubiquitous service? And I would posit that satellite has a huge role there. And one could think about the value of that by even going ahead and leveraging the cost models and data that the FCC has published around Connect America Fund. You could go look at the rural broadband experiment data in particular, because that's less capped than the CAF data, and use that as a basis for estimating coverage of wider areas, and which shows just how big this opportunity is. And then the other part, I just basically stole freely from previous tax, and this is a graph of the Excel spreadsheet that is on the FCC website, and showing growth in IoT devices and the growth of those ubiquitous uses. So that's the other half. So the notion is to go ahead and build up an inventory of these application areas that is driving this demand. So actionable recommendations. Right now, we have grade F. We have no actionable recommendations to submit at this time. So you don't have to tell me that, Dennis. I already know it.
A preemptive strike.
Huh?
A preemptive strike on your part.
Right. However, there are some things that I think that we can discuss. And one that I think falls within the bounds of at least the TAC, and we could debate whether or not it's actually this working group that should do it, but is technology changed in such a way that high cost funding, rather than being a benefit, represents a barrier to entry for new technologies, like some of these new satellite technologies, because they have to come in and compete with guys who have funding and have to take customers away from people who've already been sold. It's much easier to come in and just take this stuff over. So maybe a recommendation could be to think about phasing out high-cost funding over time. If technology is getting strong enough and good enough to actually provide ubiquitous coverage, then what's the need? But that is not an actual recommendation at this time. It's something for discussion. The second is basically around what Pierre had talked about, which is trying to put some meat on the bones of proposing these third-party data sharing entities. And what would that mean? So that's it. Turn it over for you.
Very good. Our time has gone very rapidly, but if there is a question or two, and I'm not seeing any tent cards. Going once, going twice. Marvin.
Yeah, I was very interested in that suggestion that GEO satellites are going to be able to offer 25 to 50 megabits with unlimited caps. I'm wondering where that comes from.
We just launched a satellite that has 25 to 50 megabit per seconds. And as to the caps, that's a calculation, you're right, that we need to do to see to what extent it can be truly unlimited. However, I would also point out that the capacities of those satellites, and we have another one going up that will have even more. So if it's not Viasat-2, it could be another later satellite by either us or a competitor.
Steve, I hate to say this, but the FCC has a lot of experience with unlimited plans, that I can tell you. Nothing is ever truly unlimited.
All right, very good.
And the FCC has sort of, I think, established that right now unlimited means a terabyte.
No comment.
Okay, let's go to our close. First, we need kudos to Walter. He gave each group 30 minutes, knowing that none of you would keep within your 30 minutes. So he allocated 20 minutes of time at the end, so we're actually pretty much right on schedule, courtesy of Walter. We didn't tell you that at the beginning, of course, but it's how it's worked out at the end. And having given the kudos to Walter, do you have any final words of wisdom you'd like to share with the group?
Well, first, as we agreed, I would like to thank AT&T for hosting lunch. I will no longer require a bank check from AT&T. Going forward, you've proved your integrity in this area. That's an inside joke. And also, Stephen Hayes he's attended TAC meetings before, but never as the official TAC representative. For those who don't know, Eric Kudin has been named CTO of Ericsson and is returning to Sweden, is my understanding. And Stephen will now be the permanent member from Ericsson. And finally, I've attended a lot of the work groups. I know the work that has gone into everything that's being done. It's impressive work. It will impact the commission. Although there was only one question on Steve's presentation, I know that's one of the more interesting ones in terms of what's going on. It's a great, what's happening in the satellite industry, I think, amazes everybody right now. We see some transformational change, good and bad. I mean, we have complex, the technology is advancing at an incredible rate. Satellite launch course, we didn't mention this, but we're launching, potential to launch 16 satellites a launch now is some of the planning that's going into. So that's an order of magnitude. So just launching one rocket now is an order of magnitude increase in the number of satellites going up. Satellites are going down in costs. We're seeing companies coming in all the time with proposals, and it's transformational. That will present, as Pierre pointed out eloquently, a lot of issues in terms of how we share all this. It's transformational from a regulatory viewpoint too. So again, I'd like to thank you all. Work goes on. One other thing I'll point out. We will have the chairman, and we're thinking very strongly about changing the format so that we would be presenting the classical 2 primary recommendations directly to the chairman. We think that would give us an interesting opportunity. So you should start planning for that if you have a chance to pitch to the chairman in real time of what you would recommend, actions that he should be taking. Okay, that's it.
Great. I too would like to officially welcome Steve. It didn't occur to me that you were not already the TAC member until Walter pointed that out in mid-meeting. So my apologies for not recognizing you at the start of the meeting, but you're so much a part of us that it was and working groups that you've participated in. A couple of mostly administrative items. The final meeting is December 6th. So for those of you that don't already have it on your calendar, please put it on your calendar. It will be a full day meeting.
10 to 4.
10 a.m. to 4 p.m. So we will have a lunch break in the middle, but it will be a full day as we did last year. We found that seemed to work well. Actionable recommendations, I won't single out anyone, but certainly we've already talked about that. It is time to kick things into overdrive. I calculated out that we have approximately 50 days, working days, if you take out weekends. Some of you work weekends, but if you take out weekends and Thanksgiving, I think we have 50 days between now and when you need to deliver your final documents to Walter, which will be the Friday before the 6th, preferably. So that's a short time and a lot to get done. But several of you do have prototype actionable recommendations or candidates, and so this is the time to transform them into real ones. And then for those of you that have more than 2, then you'll have to determine which 2 you wish to bring forward, because what we have adequately demonstrated as a TAC, we can overwhelm the FCC with our actionable recommendations. What was our peak here, 40 or something?
47.
47, yeah. And that was not a good number for the FCC. They like it. They like actionable recommendations, but not that many.
Like Sophie's Choice.
Yeah, particularly not without prioritization. So I think we've homed in on a good. If you really have a third one, you want to whisper it to me, we can work on that too. I am delighted that the chairman is at least now signed up. Remember, the president could call him, Congress could call him. There are all kinds of reasons why he may not be able to be here, but it is not of his choice. His choice is to be here at this point, and I'm very pleased about that and looking forward to it as well. As if there weren't already enough to do, this is the end of the year, and it's just been a short year, as you know, having skipped the first meeting of the year with the transition activities. But it's time for us to be coming up with the proposals for work groups for next year. So we do have that opportunity. So while in your spare moments, in the shower in the morning or wherever you do your thinking, be considering those opportunities for the working groups for next year, or if you think you really need to continue on with the work groups, since these, with the exception of our continued efforts with the cell phone theft, all the rest of the groups are new, so many of you may say, hey, gee, we need another year to really get there, and that's a reasonable recommendation as well. I like to close out in the way that I always do, but I always feel compelled to do so. We really have so much work going on, and like to particularly thank the work group chairs. I really like this structure, so we've gotten very good to having it pass the baton right down the line, all these little things, but it does actually make things work a lot more smoothly.
It also makes the AV people very happy.
Yeah, right.
Since we only have one, for the entire commission, we've only got that one little remote control.
No, but I really do applaud and thank the work group chairs and the subgroup chairs too. We've evolved so that subgroup chairs have big responsibilities and significant workloads that they undertake. So thanks to those. Thanks to the liaisons, many of whom are here or have, in many cases, have moved on to other things, but really appreciate that because they are a lot of the glue, and I do independently meet with the liaisons, and we talk about how things are going within the groups as well as the progress and so on, but really a talented group and a lot of people involved from the FCC, which really shows the level of interest in what we do here. Finally, I'd like to thank all the TAC members for their engagement. And if you're not fully engaged in a working group yet, get engaged in one or more of them, and most people are. Also like to thank the numerous subject matter experts. We've really connected a lot of subject matter experts either on a one-of time, or as you mentioned, Stag, bring him in at the start and he just stays. and that's a terrific asset, a great guy, and so really applaud those subject matter experts that are involved. And those that are participating, we're delighted that we do have the opportunity to stream this, so there are people out there listening and deriving benefit from these sessions.
Can I make one comment? Just one thought.
Okay, but you're going to make us run over.
Very quickly. Nomi reminded me of this, but some of you have very interesting and very valuable presentations, which under agreement, most of them are not for public consumption. But if they could be made available more generally to FCC staff and cataloged in some way, you might want to give that some thought in terms of, because this information is cached on WebExes all over the globe right now, but it would be a very useful, informative tool for the FCC.
Okay, we still made it. Final thanks go to Walter. Walter's just a round of applause for Walter. I mean, he really attends our meetings as well as running interference and spending time at the 8th floor and all of the things that he does to make this rare and valuable. So really appreciate that. And
also the liaisons. Really
I already mentioned this. You've got to be listening.
He was too busy.
Yeah. So, thank you one and all. We will see you all on December the 6th, if not before.
All right.
Take care.
Yeah.